Keras, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book Number 7, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 28. Ennio idly studied the gilt-framed panels that filled the gaps between the gold-streaked obsidian columns set into the walls of the grand banquet hall in Hades' palace, enjoying the gentle murmur of the conversation that flowed around her. Whenever Keras spoke, her attention locked on him, and she couldn't stop herself from glancing at him to check on him. When they had been dressing for the celebration, he had told her several times that he was fine, but she refused to believe him, because she could feel how much Hades welcoming him back to the underworld, to his home, meant to him, and how it was all too much for him. Her god was strong, but that strength was fragile where his emotions were concerned. They had gotten the better of him again, and she knew that he hated it because it made him feel weak. He wanted to hide from her the fact that he was still struggling to control his feelings, to stop them from overwhelming him, some foolish part of him clearly believing it would somehow mar her opinion of him. Nothing could change how much she loved him. He didn't have to be strong around her all the time. He could rely on her as he had back in Tokyo. She would be his strength when his faltered, would forever be there to guide him through and lift him up again. Her gaze strayed to him, the heat that had been slowly filling her picking up pace along with her heart as she drank her fill of him. He looked handsome in his mortal clothing, the pressed black slacks and crisp tailored dress shirt showing off his figure, but it was the light in his green eyes that entranced her as he rubbed the back of his black hair and smiled awkwardly at something someone had said to him, most likely Thanatos. The winged god of death had taken to teasing Keras the moment they had entered the banquet hall. Ennio surmised that Thanatos had hit the ambrosia while everyone had been preparing themselves for the feast. Unlike his mother, Nyx, who had changed into a beautiful deep blue robe with flecks of silver stitched into the fine material, and a matching silver sash that circled her waist, Thanatos had remained in his armor, if she could call it armor. The enormous male wore black armor only on his lower half and his forearms, which would hardly protect him from a blade. But then she supposed the god of death didn't need protection of a more conventional means. Rumor had it that he self-revived if he was killed. Even Hades had changed out of his armor, had dressed in a fine black tunic and tight trousers and knee-high riding boots. The same sort of clothing Keras had worn once, before he had been sent to the mortal world. She recalled how handsome Keras had looked in his tunic, and looked him over, deciding she preferred him in his figure-hugging black shirt. Modern mortal fashion was wonderfully revealing. Keras glanced at her, his gaze settling on her face for only a second before it fell to her body. Heat filled his green eyes as he raked them over her, desire that had shone in them more than once since she had donned the dress Persephone had given to her. The black layers of the robe crossed over her chest and twisted around her waist, cinched with gold there. They flowed over her hips in sheer layers that left her feeling a little exposed whenever she moved, and she could see her thighs through the layers as they parted. But it was the amount of cleavage the top half revealed that made her feel deeply aware of her own body. Part of her had wanted to find Persephone and ask for a different dress, something a little less revealing. But then Keras had seen her in it, and she had recalled when Cass had wanted to lend her a dress and she had refused because she had feared how Keras might react. It turned out that she loved the way he reacted whenever he looked at her. Loved it so much she itched to find a quiet place where they could be alone. "I think we have lost him," Nyx murmured.
"Who can blame him? Look at her. She is radiant. Even I would not say no to that."
Thanatos' deep voice rolled over the room, followed by Keras' black snarl. He twisted away from her and had Thanatos' throat in his grip before the male could react. He flashed emerging fangs in the god of death's face, another vicious growl rumbling from him as he tightened his grip, digging short claws into Thanatos' throat. "Keras," Ennio whispered as she sensed the darkness rising inside him. As the light in the room dimmed and everyone fell silent, their focus shifting to Keras as he stared Thanatos down. She gently placed her hand on Keras' shoulder. His head swiveled towards her and his growl cut off as his crimson gaze collided with hers. Before she could tell him that she only wanted him, he released Thanatos and pulled her into his arms, kissed her hard right in front of everyone. A blush scalded her cheeks and spread until she felt sure every inch of her was red. When Keras released her, his eyes were green again, sought hers, and danced between them. She stroked his cheeks, framed them with her palms, and kissed him softly, showing him that she was fine and his outburst hadn't angered her or made her think less of him.
I recommend you watch your words, young Thanatos,
Hades drawled, his voice calm and even. Thanatos tensed, swallowed. Keras was slow to release Enyo, kept one arm around her as he turned away from her, coming to face Thanatos. All the fires of the underworld shone in his eyes as he glared at the god.
My apologies.
Thanatos dipped his head.
I overstepped.
Keras looked as if he wanted to growl, but then forced a nod instead. She kept an eye on him as he slowly relaxed, monitoring him with her senses as the darkness Thanatos had provoked in him gradually faded. When he felt as he had before Thanatos had spoken about her and upset him, she looked at the group to her right. A blush climbed her cheeks again as the women all stared at her, including Persephone. Several of the women had donned dresses too. Megan looked radiant in a dark purple dress that showed off her bump, and Katerina had chosen a rich blue summer dress that highlighted her tanned skin and the spun caramel color of her hair. Miranda wore a pale green dress that reached her ankles and revealed nothing, something Cassandra had complained about when she had seen her. According to the sorceress, Miranda needed to learn to make the most of her assets. Evangelina had chosen to wear black leather trousers and a violet halter top that had caused Thanatos to stare until Valen had put the god of death in his place, and Hades had backed him up. Iko wore interesting mortal fashion, a ruffled black shirt, striped violet and black knee-highs, and a white and black short-sleeved shirt that had a little black ribbon at the collar. Enyo found her shoes fascinating, too. She had never seen shiny white shoes with 3-inch thick black soles before. Her unique style of dress had also drawn a few comments from Thanatos. Escher had threatened to burst every blood vessel in his body. Iko had lured her god outside for some air. Enyo had taken to watching them for a while, enjoying the innocent way they would touch hands or steal a glance at each other, and grow awkward when the other noticed them looking. Keras had told her that they had been together for months now, but they were still sweet around each other, and he had the feeling they would always be this way. She found it adorable. Most of the brothers had dressed for the occasion in the same manner as Keras, picking mortal clothing rather than the style they had worn centuries ago. Ares had paired black jeans with a dress shirt, and Merrick wore something similar. Escher had gone with a blue-gray shirt, while Diamond had opted to wear a thin, long-sleeved navy turtleneck. Both Callistos and Valen had shown up in jeans and tight t-shirts. Hades had made a few remarks about that, but both gods had been unrepentant. Valen laughed at something Merrick said, drawing her focus off to her left, where they stood talking to Cal. Escher broke away from them, striding past Enyo, heading for Diamond where he lingered with Cass in the opposite corner, speaking to her in hushed tones. Just beyond Valen and his brothers, Iris flagged down one of the serving staff and snatched a goblet of ambrosia from the male's tray. Moros helped himself too, but Apate and Oisis waved the servant away. Unlike their older brother Thanatos, the 4 siblings had changed out of their armor and wore fine black robes like their mother. It was nice of Hades to invite them too. The God King had a habit of overlooking the lesser gods and goddesses of all the realms, focusing instead on those gods and goddesses who occupied the higher echelons, such as Thanatos and Nyx. Thanatos leaned his hip on the long dark wooden table laden with food and jugs of wine and ambrosia, and swept his gold goblet towards Hades, where he sat on a throne on the other side of the table.
You raised your sons well.
Thanatos' silver eyes gleamed as he smiled and toasted Hades and Persephone. Persephone dragged her focus away from Megan, who sat beside her, her emerald eyes bright as she lifted them to Thanatos.
I am not sure there is a mother more pleased than I am right now. All of my sons married.
The room suddenly hushed. Keras cleared his throat.
Mother, not all of us are married.
She waved him away.
Of course you all are. The heart wants what the heart wants, and I can see in all of you that it has found the one it will remain constant to for the rest of your days.
Hades placed his left hand over hers and patted it. A frown wrinkled her button nose.
Do not condescend, my love. You were married to me long before our wedding night.
Hades didn't bother arguing with that, and Enyo smiled at the two of them.
I've not heard the tale of how you met, not from your lips anyway.
Enyo moved around Keras, approaching Persephone rather than Hades, joining the group of women that the queen of the underworld had gathered around her. It felt strangely good as she settled among them, picking a spot between Cassandra and Iko. The heat of Keras's gaze on her back had her glancing over her shoulder at him. Their eyes locked and her smile widened, the embers that constantly burned in her veins reigniting as she stared at him, filling her with need, a desire to lure him away from the banquet now the meal was done. Perhaps she could pretend she needed some fresh air.
Oh, I am far more interested in knowing when you will be gifting me with another grandchild.
Persephone's light tone teased her ears, but her words fell hard on Enyo. And Keras, too, judging by how his eyes shot wide and he looked close to choking.
Do not tease him,
Enyo said with a smile aimed at Persephone.
He has been through much today.
Persephone's smile was wicked.
But it is a mother's work to make her sons uncomfortable around their loves. For instance, I should ask why Valen took so very long to tell the beautiful Evangelina that he loved her.
She cast a pointed look across the room at him where he stood talking to Callistos and Merrick, near one set of windows. Valen stiffened, going perfectly still, as if that would make him invisible and stop his mother.
You know we knew before you did.
Persephone's green gaze drifted to the black-haired assassin who sat on the table to her left, picking seeds from a pomegranate. Ava's blue eyes widened.
You did?
Persephone nodded and swept a rogue wave of her scarlet hair back when it fell down across her face.
If they speak the language of the underworld and the mortal one, we know what they say.
Enyo glanced at Valen again, catching the blush that stained his cheeks. He muttered, I didn't know that. Did you know that? The shit I've said in the mortal world. The color on his cheeks deepened as his eyes grew larger. Oh, gods, the shit I've said to Ava. Cal chuckled and slapped him on the shoulder. And you complained about knowing when your brothers are getting some. Our parents know your deepest, most twisted crap now. Valen shuddered. Hades shuddered at the same time.
Believe me, I would rather I did not hear what is said in the mortal world.
He cast a look at all of his sons.
It is not as if there is one among you who has not spoken of things I do not wish to know.
Keras went to raise his hand. Hades spoke before he could fully lift it.
Well, perhaps you. You gave your father blessed relief from knowing things he should not know. But I feel Valen more than made up for your silence.
I need some air. I need to get out of here. Valen looked at Ava, a pleading edge to his expression. She shrugged.
I'm staying right here. I haven't heard any embarrassing stories about you yet. I know about the time Diamond sneezed and froze half the palace. And I know about the fights he and Escher used to get into, and the brawl that Ares had with him. None of them embarrassing enough to satisfy me, and none of them about you.
Valen looked as if he had been betrayed. Persephone looked excited. She shifted on her throne so she was facing her eager audience.
Well, let me see.
Enyo tuned her out as she grew aware of Keras looking at her again, and could feel his turbulent emotions as they ran unchecked. She turned away from the group of women and went back to him, because she didn't want him to worry that his mother would tell her things that would embarrass him. He was struggling enough as it was. He needed her on his side tonight, supporting him and not mocking him. Besides, it wasn't as if she was going anywhere. Once Keras was stronger again, his emotions leveled out and back under control, she would have plenty of time for Persephone to spill all the juicy tales of his youth. The ones she hadn't witnessed for herself anyway.
Discussing business at a time like this seems inappropriate, but I have a task for you, Thanatos.
Hades' deep voice rolled over the room, quietening Persephone. She issued a curious look to Hades.
A task?
Thanatos planted his left hand on the top of the table as he leaned towards Hades, his silver eyes bright with interest.
What would my god-king ask of me?
Hades hesitated. It lasted barely a second, but everyone noticed it. The room hushed again. Hades stared deep into Thanatos' eyes, his handsome face placid and unreadable.
I task you with finding my daughter.
Keras tensed beside Enyo, and that tension rippled through the room. affecting all of the brothers and Persephone too. Tears lined her lashes, and Megan was quick to place her hand on the goddess's shoulder. Thanatos's black eyebrows met hard above glittering silver eyes that gained a blue sheen.
You have a lead on the location of her soul.
Hades nodded and looked at Keras.
My son can tell you what he told me. Any detail you need, he will give to you. He has witnessed her in the memory of another.
Keras nodded.
Whatever you need to help you find her, you'll have it.
Enyo knew he was talking about more than just a description of what he had seen now. All of the brothers looked ready to join Thanatos on this new mission.
I take it her soul is being held in an unknown realm.
Thanatos looked at Keras, too, his great black feathered wings shifting to drape across the table behind him as he twisted to face Keras. Keras nodded.
I am not familiar with it.
Thanatos looked over his shoulder at Hades.
A challenge. I admit, it has been too long since I have felt challenged. Perhaps I will ask for the realm in which she resides as my reward.
The god of death grinned. Hades scowled.
I have no more realms to give.
The god-king lifted his gold goblet and swirled the contents, amusement flickering in his blue eyes as he regarded Nyx where she sat beside him and then Thanatos.
It is unfortunate that you desired such large realms to rule that I could only afford to give 3 all those centuries ago.
Why was it unfortunate? Being asked to fight was reward enough in Enyo's opinion, but she was a goddess of war. Being gifted a realm should have been payment enough for a god or goddess of the underworld.
I have not heard you speak of this before.
Keras stepped forwards, curiosity glimmering in his green eyes, and she could feel it running through him, too, drawing his focus away from his struggle to control his emotions. He looked from Hades to Thanatos and then Nyx.
Hypnos was there, was he not? He received the 3rd realm.
Hades nodded and sipped his drink. He lowered the goblet to rest on the table.
But Hypnos must be punished this time because he did not show up.
Nyx smiled over the rim of her own goblet, mischief crossing her fine features. Thanatos chuckled at that.
I think perhaps I forgot to tell him. The underworld was smaller back then, with less uncharted territory to spare beyond the borders of my kingdom.
Hades pursed his lips, leaned back into his throne, and then looked at Keras.
After the rebellion ended in our victory, I gifted Thanatos, Nyx, and Hypnos with a realm as promised, since they were the strongest and led other gods and goddesses.
Gods and goddesses who Enyo suspected were in the room right now, judging by how Iris paused halfway through saying something to her brother Moros, and shot a black look in her family's direction. Enyo frowned at her, and she went back to speaking with her siblings in the far corner of the room, near an open window that allowed cooler air to flow in and entice Enyo with thoughts of stepping outside, where she could be alone with Keras. Iris had caught her attention in the battle, her bloodthirstiness and skill with her daggers impressing Enyo, as it always did whenever the goddess and her siblings rode into battle with her and her brother Ares. Had Iris, Apate, Moros, and Oisis expected to receive a realm from Hades as payment for the participation in the battle to crush the first rebellion? Maybe she would ask Iris about it and hear her side of the story, too. She wanted to speak with her before the banquet was over, to talk about old times and catch up with her anyway, since it had been decades since Iris and her siblings had fought beside Enyo and Ares. But first she wanted to learn more about Hades' history with Nyx's family, and then she wanted to lure Keras outside for some air.
The second rebellion was far more exciting, though. Who among us expected the fiends to attack when Keras was newly born?
Thanatos boxed Keras on his left arm and grinned at him.
You were a squalling, whining little thing when you were born. Never a day's peace for your parents. Your mother thought you ill. Your father wanted rid of you. I did not.
Hades' words were lost as Thanatos continued, speaking over him.
You are grown into a powerful male now, though. The Nereids will sing of your victory in this battle.
Keras' brother Ares, who had been diligently standing guard over his wife, protecting her as a hydra would defend its hoard, huffed.
His victory?
Thanatos arched an eyebrow at him.
I did not see you there.
Enya wasn't sure whether the god of death was bringing up the fact that Ares had been absent, or whether he was trying to rile him by saying that he hadn't noticed Ares looming over Megan, the only male in a throng of females. Ares scowled at him, fire flickering in his dark eyes.
Someone needs to cut you off.
Nyx leaned across the table, snatched the cup of ambrosia from her son's hand, and drank the contents in one go. She sighed and smacked her lips together and slammed the goblet down.
There, now there is no excuse to argue. Thanatos is just moody. You must excuse him.
I am not moody,
he grumbled, his expression souring as he glanced at his mother.
Is this because your father summoned me?
He shuddered, his feathered wings quivering as disgust rolled across his features.
I do not even want to think about that, let alone speak of it.
Nyx leaned back in her onyx chair and smiled wistfully.
Ah, it was like old times. Remember how I missed the second rebellion because of him? Hades has never forgiven me, even though it was not my fault that I was busy and could not attend.
Thanatos curled his lip and grunted.
Busy being disgusting with Erebus.
Nyx waggled a blue-painted fingertip at him.
Your father gives me little choice and invokes his contract at his own will.
Thanatos looked even more disgusted. Nyx looked deeply satisfied with the arrangement rather than irritated by it. She sighed softly and twined a ribbon of her black hair around her finger, causing the silver strands in it to spiral around the onyx.
I paid my dues for being absent during that rebellion. A century banished to the mortal world. You must know how that feels.
She tilted her cup towards Keras. He nodded.
I do.
I was so relieved when I could return to my realm to resume rule of it.
She lifted the goblet to her lips. Thanatos jerked his head towards the far corner.
Eris wasn't so relieved. She wanted your head there for a time.
Nyx glanced at her daughter. Enyo did too. Eris was deep in conversation with her siblings, but Enyo had the feeling she was aware of her mother and brother talking about her, had tuned into them when her name had been mentioned. Having lived under her brother's rule for centuries, Enyo could sympathize. For a moment, a brief time given the lifespan of a goddess, Eris had been in control of her own life and ruling her own kingdom. Enyo could well imagine how she must have felt when her mother had returned and taken that control and realm away from her. Now that Enyo was free of her brother, she never wanted to go back. The heat of Keras's gaze on her had a shiver traipsing down her spine, had warmth curling through her together with a sense of anticipation. He slipped his arm around her waist, the brush of his body against hers almost too much to bear as he leaned in close. He murmured into her ear,
"Walk with me."
She was quick to nod, barely waited for him to make their excuses to his father and Thanatos and Nyx, before she was striding across the mosaic floor, heading for the twin doors that led out into the garden, eager to be alone with them. Chapter 29. The stifling heat of the room gave way to cool air, and Enyo breathed deep of it as she stepped out onto the terrace that ran along the side of the palace. She walked to the onyx balustrade that lined the edge of the paved area, separating it from the garden below, and gazed at the flowers and trees that filled the formal grounds.
Something is wrong.
Keras stepped up behind her, wrapped his arms around her, and locked his hands over her stomach. He settled his chin on her shoulder.
Talk to me.
She smiled, loving how attuned to her he was. Her mood had barely begun to slip before he had noticed it and whisked her away. She was just as attuned to him, could feel that he needed this moment alone together as much as she did. He was still struggling against the darkness Thanatos had provoked in him. It was right there in his feelings and in the tight way he held her to him, clutching her against his body. That possessive hold thrilled her.
I am disappointed that my brother did not come to the battle.
She leaned her back against his front, her focus shifting away from the garden and settling on him, and how good it felt to be held like this by him. Warmth flowed through her as he pulled her closer.
Would you like me to hunt him down and punish him?
He nuzzled her neck and dropped a kiss on it.
Or cheer you up?
She smiled. She knew which he would prefer. It wasn't the first time he had made it clear that he wanted to fight her brother, and it wasn't the first time he had offered to take her mind off him rather than going to mete out justice on her behalf. Only this time she had the feeling that his way of cheering her up would be far more wicked, and far more satisfying than it had been in the past. Keras released her, placed his hands on her hips, and turned her around to face him. His eyebrows knitted as he looked her over, his voice dropping to a sultry whisper that matched the heat in his gaze.
"You've been driving me crazy all night. The sight of you in this dress. I don't know whether I want to peel it off you or keep it in place so I can drink my fill of how beautiful you look for a little longer."
She lightly shoved his chest with her left hand. He grimaced.
Oh, gods!
Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening.
Sorry.
She had tended to his wounds when they had returned from the battle, but he was still healing. He wasn't the only one with injuries either. Not that it was stopping her from convincing him to peel the long black robe from her body, or perhaps keeping it on and finding a quiet corner where the guards wouldn't see them. Keras rubbed at his shoulder.
"It's fine, just sore."
His green gaze raked over her again, igniting fire in its wake, the look in it telling her that she wasn't alone in wanting to find that quiet corner. But this banquet was about him and his brothers. There was no slipping away unnoticed when he was meant to be the center of attention. She settled for running her hands down his chest, feeling his hard muscles beneath the fine material of his black shirt, and letting her imagination run wild. The banquet would end soon enough, and they could return to his home. Their home.
"I like that look on you,"
Keras murmured and captured her hand, drew her closer as his gaze grew hooded and dropped to her lips.
What look?
"You look happy."
He slid his arm around her waist and eased her against him, his hard body pressing into her and stoking the fire in her veins. The desire to kiss him. She thought about what he had said.
I am happy.
Now that she was thinking about it, it struck her that she was, and that she couldn't remember the last time she had felt this way. Light, warm, filled with energy, with hope for the future. She smiled into Keras's eyes, seeing her future in him, a future she had wanted for as long as she could remember, one she had thought she would never have. He pulled her to him, his gaze locked on her mouth, sending anticipation swirling through her. She licked her lips, eager for his kiss, aware that if it happened, they would end up finding that quiet corner and making love. A crimson corona encircled his pupils as his gaze dropped to her body, the darkness she could feel in him rising as it devoured the emerald of his irises. His thoughts were traversing dangerous paths again. Enya looped her arms around his neck and stroked the hair by his nape, teased it with her fingers in a way she hoped would pull his focus away from what Thanatos had said about her. When the red invading his eyes only spread, she tried a different tactic.
I do not want anyone but you, Keras,
she husked, her voice scraping low as his body brushed hers, sending a sharp thrill through her. His scarlet eyes heated, had awareness washing through her together with anticipation, a rush of tingles and warmth that had her on the verge of begging him to do something, to give in to that need building in his eyes. It built inside her, too, rising rapidly as her senses stretched around her, and she detected only a handful of guards, all of them either close to the house or the perimeter wall of the garden. Keras lifted his right hand from her wrist, flexed his fingers near her shoulder, and then brushed his fingers over the thick strap of her dress. She trembled as the tips of them grazed her skin, as he eased the black material aside and it fell to rest against her arm. He leaned towards her, his warm breath skating over her flesh as he neared her, as he swept his lips over her shoulder and downwards.
"Gods, this dress,"
he muttered, and fisted the material at her waist. He planted his hands against her waist a moment later, pressed his palms into her as he pushed them upwards, past the dip in her waist to her ribs, drawing the skirt of her dress up with it. Cool air swirled around her exposed shins.
"I want to kill every male who looked at you tonight."
He kissed lower as he bunched her dress in the small of her back, twisted it so the hem rose higher.
"I want every male in this world to know you're mine."
Her heart fluttered, fire igniting in her veins as those words rocked her, and her soul answered him. She wanted that too. She wanted the world to know that she was his, and she wanted it to know that he was hers too. She wanted to kill every female who dared to look at him, who had the audacity to comment on his good looks or gaze at him in a way that invited him to go to them. She wanted to stake a claim on him. He growled as he pulled her to him, as he grabbed her backside and lifted her. Darkness whirled around her and her breath left her in a rush as her back hit something solid and cool. Keras pressed against her, pinning her to a wall in the garden, stealing her focus away from the world and narrowing it down to only him as he pushed her up it. He tugged at her dress, pulling the layers of fabric up, his growl growing frustrated as he tried to get to her. Enya released him and pulled at her dress with him, her pulse rushing faster and faster, pounding in her ears as need built inside her like a storm that would break at any moment. When her dress was close to being conquered, she couldn't stop her hands from flying to the waist of his trousers. She made fast work of his belt, didn't slow as she tackled the button and eased the zipper down. Keras grunted as she shoved at his trousers, pushing them down his hips, and growled as she freed him. She didn't get a chance to touch him. On a low, blood-heating snarl, he tore her underwear away and buried himself in her. She bit her lip to stifle the cry of pleasure that wanted to burst from her as he plunged into her, as he stretched and filled her. Keras growled and she lowered her eyes from the sky to him, stilled as she met his scarlet gaze. Darkness reigned in it as it held hers, pushed the storm inside her to a crescendo and her over the edge. Need overcame her, tore down her control and made her a slave to it, to the desperate craving for this moment, for this wild, untamed side of him. The fight on the Tokyo rooftop came flooding back, roused the hunger in her veins to startling new heights, filling her with wicked needs that only Keras could satisfy, and only when he was like this. On another blood-heating growl, he dug his fingers into her backside and thrust into her, pressing her to the wall with each brutal meeting of their bodies. Enya clung to him, lost in his eyes as he took her, as she surrendered to him. She gripped his nape with one hand and covered her mouth with the other, stifling the moans that burst against her palm with each deep thrust of his length. Oh, gods! Keras snarled and gripped her harder, flashed fangs that sent another thrill through her as she stared at his mouth, as her mind raced to recall what he had been on the verge of doing on that rooftop, staking a claim on her. She wanted that now, embraced this side of him, found she loved it as much as she loved his softer side. He pressed closer, pumping her harder and faster, his breath leaving him on feral grunts. He lifted his right hand and yanked her dress down, covered her nipple with his mouth and sucked hard. She cried against her hand as sparks skittered over her breast, the moan muffled but still audible, and Keras growled in response. He sucked harder as he plunged deeper, angled his hips and took her out of her mind. Enya moaned with each meeting of their bodies, the sweet slam of his pelvis against her sensitive bead causing waves of tingles that had her desperate for more, had her tightening her grip on his nape and digging her fingers in. More! She let her hand fall from her lips, too far gone to care if anyone heard them, the need inside her too great to deny. He took her harder, faster still, his hips pistoning and pushing her higher. She reached for release, clenched him, and silently begged him for that one push she needed, the one that would send her over the edge into the bliss she could feel just beyond her reach. Keras snarled low, lifted his head, sank his fangs into her left shoulder. Pleasure detonated inside her, had a cry bursting from her lips as her entire body jerked to meet his, as lightning crashed through her and her ears rang. Her thighs quivered violently as Keras kept thrusting, as he held her in place with his fangs and took her, possessing her. She swam in the haze of her climax, aware of his fangs in her, of how possessive his bite was, how he was using it to control her to a degree, to stake a claim on her. The darkness in him needed this, and gods, she needed it too. Heat and sparks rushed through her again as he plunged deep into her, and his length pulsed. She quaked with him, breathing hard, lost in the moment and the feel of his fangs in her shoulder. If she'd had fangs of her own, she would have marked him too. She settled for digging her nails into his neck as she struggled to come down, as he held her in place with his fangs and remained inside her. She drifted with him, unaware of anything but him. When he eventually pulled his fangs from her shoulder, he refused to look at her, and cold replaced the warmth as she looked at him, as she felt the war erupting inside him, the emotions that were tearing him apart. Ennio palmed his cheeks and made him look at her, aware of what he needed to hear.
Gods, that was incredible.
She smiled for him when he looked as if he didn't believe her, because she needed him to know she was telling the truth.
Do not get me wrong. I like the steady, controlled side of you, but I like this side of you too. The wild, dark side.
He still didn't look as if he believed her. She gathered her courage, tamped down her nerves, and somehow found the strength to put it out there as she grazed her fingers over his throat.
If I had fangs like you, I would mark you for all to see.
On a low growl, he swooped on her mouth and kissed her hard, clutched her to him and stole her breath. She sank into his kiss, savoring it and the emotion she could feel inside him, ones that were warm now, calm and filled with light. He broke away from her lips and swept his tongue over her shoulder, carefully lifted the strap of her dress and covered the bite mark with it. His hand lingered on it as he lowered her, his gaze fixed there, no trace of red in it now, only warm emerald that sparkled. Ennio fixed her dress and then his trousers, and he was still staring at his hand and the point where he had bitten her when she was done. She gently captured his cheek again and kissed him, tried to ignore the heat that began to build in her veins again, demanding an encore. When she pulled him back this time, Keras looked a little dazed. She opened her mouth to tell him words she hadn't found the courage to say to him yet. A female screamed. Chapter 30. Keras stepped the moment his mother's harrowing scream reached his ears, sending a chill shooting down his spine. Darkness whirled around him and then parted, and his eyes widened. His mother stood behind his father, cradling him to her chest as thorny black brambles rose up around them both to form a wall between them and the other occupants of the room. Tears streaked Persephone's ashen cheeks as she clutched Hades to her, supporting his head on her arm, her hand stroking his face as he grimaced and growled, flashing fangs.
What happened?
Keras's gaze leaped to Thanatos and then his brother Ares. Both men wore grim expressions, but Thanatos' silver eyes flickered ethereal blue.
Eris,
the god of death growled, his black eyebrows knitted hard. He glanced at his mother. Nyx glared at him.
I knew nothing of this.
Nothing of what? Keras bit out, hemorrhaging patience.
Fucking Eris attacked Dad,
Valen snarled, and lightning chased over his fingertips. Those arcs of electricity crackled brighter as he swiftly turned to his right, his golden eyes flashing dangerously. Ennio held up her hands the moment she manifested. Valen backed down. Her jade eyes shifted from his brother to his parents and widened.
Oh, gods, what happened?
Keras still hadn't gotten the answer to that question himself, and he wanted to know what the hell was going on, because it looked a lot like Eris had attempted to kill his father. Cold snaked down his spine and curled around his heart.
She's with the enemy,
he whispered, a shiver cascading over his skin beneath his clothes as he said that, and that feeling cemented inside him. He looked around the room and barely leashed the growl that rose up his throat as he realized that it wasn't only Eris who was now missing from the celebration.
The others are working with her?
Nyx's voice gained a sharp edge as she looked at Hades.
I did not know. My own damned spawn rising up against us. I will destroy them all, I swear it, my god king.
His father shifted pain-filled crimson eyes to her, his chest heaving as he labored for breath.
Please, you must let us near him,
Megan said, reaching for Persephone and then snatching her hand back when the brambles shot towards her. Ares gripped her upper arms and held her back, stopping her from making another attempt to reach their mother. Persephone's mothering instincts had always been strong, a protective streak that ran as deep in her as it did in Hades. It was going to take more than just Megan to convince his mother to let anyone near Hades now, when he was vulnerable.
We can help.
Cassandra rounded the table and came to stand beside Megan. She lifted her hand and colorful light encircled it, ribbons that chased around her fingers.
Together we can heal him.
I want their heads,
Hades roared and tried to push out of Persephone's arms. He made it only a few inches before he sagged back against her, breathing harder than before, and shaking. The sight of his father injured, visibly weakening before his eyes, tugged at the darkness inside Keras, pulling it to the fore so swiftly he didn't have a chance to tamp it down. It stole control from him, whispering insidious words in his mind, clawing at his heart. Because this was his fault. He had left his father unguarded. "Keras," Enyo whispered, and he shunned her as she reached a hand out to him, flicked a glance at it that warned her not to touch him. This was her fault, too. He had been distracted by her. He had been distracted by her, and his father had paid for it, and God's help this world if he died. "What happened?" he growled again. Ares locked gazes with him, a bleak look filling his dark eyes even as they flickered with fire.
Iris wished to speak with him, and he allowed it. And the next thing I knew, she had stabbed him. Thankfully, Father sensed her intent or something, because he moved and she missed her target. Only nailed him in the shoulder rather than the heart. Fucking bitch.
Keras looked their father over as he tightly gripped the arms of his chair, his teeth gritted as his face twisted in pain. His green gaze fixed on the slick patch on his father's right shoulder. He stepped to the other side and the brambles snapped at him, attempting to drive him back. He refused to go, flinched as they slashed his face. Persephone jerked to face him, her green eyes enormous as they fixed on the cut darting across his left cheek.
"Let me near him, Mother."
He implored her with his eyes, spoke gently to her in the hope it would reach her and offer her comfort. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to protect Hades all by herself. He would destroy anyone who sought to harm his father. Shadows snaked from beneath his feet and slithered over the brambles, entwining with them. As they made contact, her pain and fear rolled into him, stole his breath, and had tears filling his eyes. She feared the worst.
"He will not die, but we must treat him. If my suspicions are correct, then he must be seen to immediately. Let me near him. Let me see."
Keras lifted his right hand slowly, trying not to spook his mother by moving too fast, rousing her instincts to protect Hades from a possible attack. Her gaze danced between his hand and his face, indecision crossing her delicate features. He could feel the war in her, tried to be patient, but it was hard. He needed to get a look at his father's wound. He needed to know if he was right about Iris, and this wasn't just an attack spurred by anger over the conversation that had taken place before Keras had gone out into the garden to be alone with Enyo. Maybe her anger was in part due to that conversation, but it hadn't been born tonight. It had been festering inside her for centuries, and she had been plotting his father's demise from the moment he had given only Thanatos, Nyx, and Hypnos realms to rule. The brambles surrounding his father parted, and Keras eased his hands forwards, weathered a vicious snarl from his father as he fingered the cut in his black tunic, and carefully parted the material. Keras loosed a snarl of his own. Violet tendrils snaked from the 2-inch stab wound, spreading across his father's pale skin.
"Wraith blade,"
he growled, and the tension in the room increased. Several of his brothers cursed, and Thanatos detailed the ways he was going to destroy Iris and her cohorts when he found them. Instinct pushed Keras to shun Thanatos and Nyx's help, but sense told him to deny it. He was going to need strong allies in this fight, and he believed that both Nyx and Thanatos truly hadn't known anything about Iris's plans, and that they too were targets. Keras looked across his father and mother to Megan, where she hovered near the edge of the brambles, Ares still holding her back.
"Can you heal this?"
She was quick to nod, but her chocolate eyes revealed doubt.
"Sweetheart,"
Ares warned. She angled her head and looked up at him. "Let me try." His brother sighed. Cassandra glanced at Ares. "She will not be alone. I will help too." "As will I," Persephone murmured, her green gaze fixed on Hades, all the worry Keras could feel in her shining in her eyes. Hades' eyes slipped shut and his cheeks paled further.
"Take him to his chambers,"
Keras said. His mother nodded and disappeared. Ares stepped with Megan, and Diamond took hold of Cassandra's arm and teleported with her. The rest of Keras's brothers followed with their women. Before Keras could step to his parents' bedroom, Enyo took hold of his wrist. He glanced at her and lingered as she slipped her hand down to his, as her fingertips gently pressed against his palm. "You don't have to face this alone either, Keras." She stroked her fingers across his skin, sending warmth rolling up his arm, and the darkness that had been building inside him gradually abated as he looked into her eyes and saw she meant those words, saw that she was there with him.
"This wasn't your fault,"
she whispered, words he wished were true. She stepped up to him and lifted her other hand, brushed her palm across his cheek, and kept his eyes on hers.
"This wasn't your fault."
She said it more firmly this time, her steady jade gaze telling him that she wasn't going to accept him blaming himself for what had happened to his father, that she was going to do whatever it took to make him see that this had been unavoidable. Thanatos helped.
Mother did not even have time to react.
The god of death's voice held a darkness that revealed the depth of his anger. His flickering blue eyes shifted from the empty throne where Hades had been to Keras.
You could not have stopped her.
It happened too quickly. One moment they were conversing, and the next she stabbed him, and they were all gone.
Nyx continued to gaze at the throne, a somber look on her face.
I failed my god king.
Thanatos leaned over and placed his hand on his mother's slight shoulder.
Do not blame yourself either. None of us could have known what Iris planned. She played us well.
Not her. Iris might be leading the enemy, but it was another who put together this plan. Apate. She played us well. Keras growled and balled his free hand into a fist. The goddess of deceit had certainly lived up to her name. Thanatos was right, and none of them had seen this coming. Apate must have planned it all for her sister, right down to sacrificing Nemesis in order to make it look as if Keras and his brothers had won this war. Had Nemesis known she was a pawn, that she would be sacrificed to ensure Iris and her siblings gained an audience with Hades, could get close enough to him to kill him? Keras doubted that she had. Nemesis, like the others, had believed she would receive a place to rule at the end of this plot against his father. Apate had worked her wicked magic well indeed, moving her pawns into place, making them believe they would gain whatever Iris had promised them. She had fooled them all. She had fooled him and his brothers, too. He gripped Enyo's hand and stepped with her. Chapter 31. The second Keras landed in his father's black and gold-walled bedchamber, someone shoved him aside.
Make way!
Katerina hurried past him with a bowl of water, Aiko following hot on her heels with some towels. Ares grunted something under his breath as he wetted one of the small towels and squeezed it out. Rather than applying it to their father's bare chest, he pressed the rolled-up towel against Megan's forehead. She huffed and leaned forwards. Her hands shook as they framed the wound on Hades' chest.
This is too dangerous,
Ares grumbled.
You've said that 100 times already,
Megan snapped, and then sagged, her tone softening.
Sorry.
Cass sat on the enormous bed on the other side of his father, Persephone beside her. His mother had her hand to his father's head, her eyes closed as she worked to help heal him. The sorceress ghosted her hands over the length of his body, her eyes sparkling with silver as pale light glowed from her palms.
He's strong. No need to fret.
Keras wasn't sure who she was directing those words at. Probably all of them. There wasn't a single person among his brothers and their women who didn't look worried as they surrounded the large bed. Megan blew out her breath and lifted her hand. Before she could swipe it across her brow and her dark hair, Ares gently smoothed the damp cloth across her skin and tenderly brushed her hair back from her face.
You're doing great, baby,
he murmured and kneaded her shoulder with his other hand.
It's working.
She nodded.
But if you feel even the slightest twinge...
I know.
Her gaze fell to her swollen belly.
I'd never risk her.
Ares looked as if he wanted to argue, but wisely bit his tongue. Keras paced as he waited, glancing from time to time at his father to see how far the spread of the violet tendrils had reversed. When Megan had healed Escher, it had happened far more quickly. Was the toxin from the Wraith's blade having a worse effect on Hades? Or was it because Megan was heavily pregnant and holding back some of her energy? He couldn't blame her for doing so if she was. Hades would be furious if she harmed her unborn child for his sake. Ares would be furious too. Cass moved around to Megan's side and muscled Ares out of the way. Her brother glared at the sorceress as she moved behind Megan and settled for rubbing her shoulders and murmuring words of encouragement. Keras glanced at his father's chest again. Relief bloomed sweetly inside him. The tendrils were small now, barely a centimeter or two long. Cass whispered words that caused green and blue ribbons of light to chase around her palms, and then placed her hand on Ares where it gripped Megan's shoulder. His brother grunted as the light burst from Cass's palm, forming a circle that resembled the one she had used in Scotland on the witch, only in miniature. The glyphs inside the smaller circles set around the ring glowed red. Ares' face contorted as his fiery eyes darted to the sorceress, and Megan gasped and jerked. The remaining tendrils were pulled back into the wound, and wisps of violet smoke rose from the gash. Cass released Ares and wiped her hand on her clothes, keeping her eyes fixed on anywhere but his brother as she said,
"What's a little energy transfer between a couple?"
A little?
Ares rumbled, a hard frown pinching his dark eyebrows together.
I think I just lost a few centuries.
"Oh, do not be over-dramatic."
Cass waved him away, all bravado that was instantly ruined when she hurried away from him, making a fast exit in Diamond's direction. Ares looked as if he wanted to pursue her, but then huffed and rounded Megan, turning her to face him at the same time. He looked her over, brushing his thumbs across her cheeks and smoothing her damp hair back.
You good?
He murmured softly, his brow furrowing as he gazed down into her eyes. She nodded.
"Peachy."
Her dark eyes slid to Hades.
"I've done all I can. It's down to him now."
Persephone stroked Hades' black hair from his brow, her gaze loving as she leaned over him. He was breathing more easily now, but was still too pale for Keras' liking. He told himself that his father was strong. He would survive this. He looked at the angry wound on his chest. His father would survive this.
I don't get it,
Diamond muttered, drawing Keras' focus to him. The remaining Fury is dead, Nemesis is gone, and her army has been decimated or spread to the four corners of the underworld and unlikely to return. What's Iris's plan? Keras wasn't sure himself.
Perhaps desperation drove her to do it. She aimed for his heart,
Merrick put in, his expression grave as he stared at Hades.
She wants to rule this realm or split it between her and her siblings. Killing father would gain her enough power that she could take control of the underworld. I don't think many would rise against someone who took him down.
Maybe losing Nemesis and the other Fury pushed her to do something. Valen rubbed his thumb across his lower lip.
I just said that.
Merrick frowned at him. Valen shot daggers right back at him. That wasn't it. Keras shook his head. They were overlooking something, missing something. He had the feeling this had been the plan all along.
No, they sacrificed Nemesis so they could get close to father.
Keras stopped pacing and looked at him where he lay on the bed, deathly pale against the black sheets.
If it was, then did they want to kill him or take his blood?
Escher stepped forwards, his knees pressing against the edge of the bed, a storm building in his blue eyes. The Fury is dead. If they want to use Dad's blood, then they'd need to get their hands on Mari, and that is not happening. Cal growled, taking hold of her hand and clutching it tightly. Not again. She patted his hand and closed the gap between them, pressing against his side, concern lighting her blue-green eyes as a breeze played in her golden hair.
"No one is taking me again."
We could ask the Moirai what they see now.
Merrick's suggestion was a good one. The Moirai hadn't been in touch to say anything had changed, something Keras had overlooked when he had been swept up in the moment, foolishly believing himself the victor and that they had averted the calamity the three fates had foreseen.
Are we sure the Fury is dead?
Ares' gaze came to land on Keras. She's dead, Cal said. We all saw it. I cut her in half. No way she could have survived that. But they didn't have a body to prove it. Keras ran over everything that had happened in the battle, replaying it on repeat in his mind, looking for something out of place, something that didn't seem right, a clue. When he found nothing, he looked at his brothers. His gaze landed on Katerina, and he stilled right down to his breathing. They didn't have a body to prove it. The clue was right there.
What if we only saw what the enemy wanted us to see?
He stared at Katerina, a mortal turned hybrid.
What do you mean?
Ares twisted to face him, his left hand remaining on Megan's shoulder as she checked Hades over.
At the gate in Olympus, the guards were confused. The commander saw 2 women Enyo's age with an escort of Valkyries. Another guard swore they were young women and blonde.
Miranda's eyes widened.
I thought it was strange that they didn't try to stop her, but then I thought perhaps we were allowed to travel to the city. I tried to get the guards to help me, but none of them responded.
You were in contact with Meadow. I need you to try to cast an illusion.
Keras shifted a step towards her.
An illusion?
Escher didn't sound happy about that, and Keras could understand why. Lizabeta, the illusionist, had been the one to kill Iko. Iko came to him together with Diamond and soothed him as Keras returned his focus to Miranda. Miranda closed her eyes and drew down a deep breath, and doubt laced her French accent as she spoke.
I'm not sure how to do this.
Cal rubbed her shoulder. I guess you just focus on who you want to see the illusion and sort of imagine it? She nodded and frowned, her head lowering as tense seconds trickled past. Just as Keras thought nothing was going to happen and he had been wrong, an image built around him, a beautiful concert hall with rows of empty red velvet seats. It lasted barely 30 seconds before it fragmented. Miranda released her breath and sagged forwards.
Did it work?
Her tropical eyes lifted to him. Keras nodded, mentally cursed. He should have considered all the angles when Cal had cut the Fury down, should have remembered what had happened at the gate in Olympus earlier, but he had been too swept up in the thought that it was over and he could return home to build a life for himself again, one where Enyo would be at his side. A low growl came from his father's direction.
My love?
Persephone cooed and leaned over him, feathering her fingers across his brow. He frowned and leaned away from her touch, and then sagged into the pillows and accepted it when she pouted at him. Her ruby hair spilled across the pillow beside his head as she fussed over him.
How do you feel?
His scarlet eyes and the power that pressed down on Keras told him that his father felt angry.
Well enough,
he said, his voice strong. Too strong. His father was pushing himself for some reason. It dawned on Keras when he spoke again.
The blade, my blood.
Hades struggled to sit up as Persephone kept trying to drag him back down again, said things about him resting that he ignored.
They will open a gate with it.
Wait, what? Ares barked. Keras's thoughts exactly. Cassandra said,
Like you did for me?
And Keras wanted to growl all over again. He should have thought of that too. When Cassandra had broken free of Merrick during a teleport, she'd had a showdown with their father and had been sent back to Diamond through the New York gate.
Lie down,
Persephone muttered, clawing at Hades' good shoulder, eventually getting her way. When his father was settled on his back again, resting as she wanted, she looked at Keras and then his brothers.
Your father has the power to open a gate at will. It was how the realms were connected long ago, before he built the new gates and bound them to all of you.
Something finally clicked. This had been the enemy's plan all along. They had always intended to lure Hades into a false sense of security, making him believe he had won, and making him lower his guard so they could get close enough to deal not only a potentially fatal blow to him, but get their hands on his blood. Blood that would make the remaining Fury on the enemy's side incredibly powerful. She would easily be able to open a gate.
We have to be ready to move. Now. We have to find them.
Keras looked at each of his brothers in turn. All of them nodded as their faces set in hard lines.
Wait, Hades said. I will be able to feel it when they open a gate.
Keras didn't want to wait. He needed to do something. He needed to be out there hunting for the traitors and the Fury, and he wasn't alone. Crimson ringed Escher's blue eyes, revealing his brother's thoughts trod the same path as his.
Trust in Thanatos and Nyx.
His father's scarlet eyes were as serious as he had ever seen them, as his gaze darted to him and locked with them. Keras wasn't sure he could. Iris and her siblings were related to them, and for all he knew, their determination to participate in the coming battle could all be a ruse devised by Apate. He wanted to believe they were loyal to his father, but it was difficult.
You will not get a choice.
Persephone caressed Hades' arm as she looked at Keras.
Thanatos and Nyx will want to be involved. They will want to punish Iris and the others. This is an affront to them, too.
He thought about what Thanatos had said to Nyx. Iris had ruled Nyx's realm for a century while she had been absent, and had been angry when that power had been stripped from her when Hades had forgiven Nyx and allowed her to return.
When I sense the gate, we will move.
Hades sat up again. Oh, no, you will not, Persephone snapped, fear washing across her features as she gripped his shoulder. You are staying here. For all we know, they want you on the battlefield again, so they can have another chance to kill you. If they kill you— She cut herself off, her words ending on a choked sob. Hades looked as if he would relent, but then his face hardened, his red eyes brightening as he turned his cheek to her.
I will need my armor and my bident.
Keras was getting him neither of those things. His mother was right. They couldn't risk Hades leaving the palace, not when he was weak. He could understand his father's need to fight, to kill the ones who had done this to him, but he couldn't allow it. Somehow they needed to convince Hades to stay in his palace, protected by his guards, even if the enemy attacked. But how was Keras meant to make his father do something he didn't want to do? Hades was more stubborn than the worst of him and his brothers, and liable to do the opposite of something if he felt he was being ordered around by them or his wife. Keras glanced at his brothers. All of them wore thoughtful looks, were clearly trying to figure out how to stop their father from leaving the palace just as he was. Ares' expression gained a pained edge, one that had Keras wanting to take a step towards him to offer him comfort, even when he wasn't sure what was wrong. Ares' broad shoulders shifted as he drew down a deep breath and released it, resolve filling his dark eyes as they settled on Hades and then pain flickering in their depths as he looked at Megan.
I need to go with my brothers,
he said, a tremble in his deep voice that relayed how much that decision hurt him, and how much strain it placed on him. Wait. Megan whirled to face him, fear brightening her dark eyes. Wait, no. You said you wouldn't. Her hand shifted to her stomach, and she clutched it as her eyebrows furrowed. You said you'd stay with me, safe with me. Ares sucked down another breath.
I know, but I have to be out there. They need me.
I need you. She lunged for his arm, gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. I don't want to be alone here. Ares swept his fingers under her chin and lifted it, smiled shakily down into her eyes as his brow furrowed.
You won't be alone. The guards will be here. Mother will be here.
Megan grew frantic, her voice rising in pitch as she rubbed her belly. Guards? Are they strong enough to defend this palace? They're not you, Ares. They're not gods, and I don't know if they can fight. I haven't seen them fight. I've seen them stand around. She made a valid point, but she didn't have to worry. The palace guards were highly trained, and they were strong. But something told Keras that Ares had been banking on her panicking like this. Calm yourself, my love, Persephone murmured, as gentle as a summer's breeze. But her words were lost on Megan. And the others? Iko, Ava? Are the guards strong enough to protect them? Megan's eyes slowly widened and her breathing quickened. I'm not the only one being left here.
You felt safe here before,
Ares said. Well, that was before someone tried to stab your father through the heart. Ares stooped so he was eye level with her and rubbed her arms.
I don't intend to leave you unguarded, sweetheart, but I have to go with Keras and the others. They need me in this fight. I swear that I'll be careful. What do you need to make you feel safe while I'm gone?
And there it was. Keras swore Ares had been taking lessons from Apate, because Megan looked straight at Hades. Their father scowled at Ares, but all of his fight fled him as his gaze shifted back to Megan where she stood rubbing her baby bump with trembling hands, a stricken look on her pale face.
Very well.
Hades sagged back against the pillows.
I know when I am defeated.
The shadows finally lifted from Persephone's face and Megan relaxed, her fear washing away as she looked at Hades. It returned when she lifted her dark brown gaze to Ares. Be careful, she whispered. Ares slung his arm around her shoulders and tucked her against his side.
You know me. You know my brothers. We'll have each other's backs, and we're all coming back from this. Want me to rub oil into your belly?
She pouted a little and nodded. Ares led her away. Keras' brothers and their women slowly followed, leaving him alone with Enyo and his parents.
You know what you must do,
his father said. Keras nodded.
I swear, I will make them pay, Father.
Darkness curled through his veins, hunger mounting inside him that wouldn't be satisfied until the blood of Eris, Apate, Oisis, and Moros and the Fury bathed his hands. He was going to slaughter them all. Chapter 32. The weight was killing him. Keras tried to listen to what Valen was saying as he leaned over the map of the underworld in the war room of the palace. But it was hard as anticipation gnawed at his insides and rage simmered in his veins. The darkness that had risen within him the second he had seen his father injured, betrayed by lesser goddesses and a lesser god of his own realm, still writhed inside him, clouding his thoughts and darkening the corners of his mind. He wanted vengeance, burned with a hunger for it, a black need to mete out justice to those who had turned against his family. Thanatos paced into view beyond Valen, Merrick, and Daimon. The grim god of death was as impatient as Keras, had muttered barely 5 words since they had decided to hold a meeting to discuss the enemy and their next move. Nick stroked a hand over Thanatos' black-feathered wing as he pivoted on his heel. He didn't spare her a glance, kept his fiery blue eyes fixed on the stone floor of the huge room as he strode towards the shelves of books that lined the wall to Keras' left. Keras looked at each of his brothers in turn, seeing that he and Thanatos weren't alone. Everyone was itching to get going. Ares planted a hand against the edge of the 3D map and rubbed his free hand across his mouth as his dark eyebrows pinched above flickering amber eyes.
Would she attack the palace?
Concern laced his brother's deep voice, and Keras knew the path of his thoughts. He was worried about Megan being placed in danger. Keras reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. The metal of the black armor Ares wore was cool against his bare palm. Ares didn't want to leave Megan's side. He could see it in his brother's eyes, and Keras was grateful that Ares was making this sacrifice, putting himself through this pain. His decision to head onto the battlefield was the only thing stopping their father from being out there. Keras swore he would keep his brothers safe for Megan. He would keep all of his brothers safe. He wouldn't let anything happen to them. He didn't know what sort of force they were up against, but his gut said this fight wasn't going to be easy. Everything had been building towards this, Apate's plan pushing them to this point. He wasn't a fool. He knew she had been guiding them on this path, making whatever move was necessary to bring them to this moment. Attacking Hades had always been the plan. The enemy had wanted all along to force him and his brothers to close the gates, keeping them busy while they put everything into place for an assault on their father, an attack that would either kill him and give them the power to open a gate and force the underworld and the mortal one to collide, or would result in only the latter. Either way, Eris and her side were getting what they wanted, the underworld and chaos, unless Keras, his brothers, and their allies could stop them. The urge to pace was strong as he waited, deeply aware that someone was missing from their group. He felt it like a hole inside him, an abyss that terrified him, drew him to it as darkness poured into it, filling it like a well, one he felt sure he would drown in. A shiver bolted down his spine as the scent of lilacs hit him. Enyo. He turned on a pinhead to face her. She strode through the double doors of the war room, a sight to behold in her black and silver armor. The modest breastplate was at odds to the shortness of the skirt that barely reached mid-thigh. The pointed slats of it moved with each stride she took into the room, flashing the black material that protected her legs beneath and gave her some modesty. The silver detailing on her greaves and the vambraces that shielded her forearms flashed as it caught the candlelight. "Well," he said, shooting for all business when what he really wanted to say was how beautiful she looked, how arousing he found her when she wore her armor. This really wasn't the place for such talk, though.
"The more I confirm that nothing has altered, the future they see is still the same."
She removed her silver-edged black Corinthian helmet. The beauty of her struck him hard, had him taking a step towards her before he realized what he was doing. Thanatos chuckled and spoke in a hushed voice.
You would think she was the sorceress in the room. Look how bewitched he is.
"Who can deny the beauty of Enyo?" Nick said. "Many a man would fall on their sword at her bidding if they witnessed her in battle."
Many a man would want her to fall on their
Thanatos cut off. Keras glared over his shoulder at the mountainous god of death, almost smiled when he found Nyx with her hand in the air near his head, and Thanatos with his head angled to one side, a red mark forming on his ear.
Do you want me to order you to go home?
Nyx tipped her chin up and looked down her nose at him, which was a feat considering Thanatos had at least 10 inches on her. Thanatos shrugged and rubbed the back of his head.
Continue, my dear.
Nyx turned a smile on Enyo. Keras supposed it was meant to be encouraging. It came off chilling.
They still see the gates breached and everything in ruin, with the two realms bleeding together.
Enyo kept her gaze locked on Keras, something he appreciated, since he was considering punching the god of death himself as punishment for daring to find Enyo alluring.
Man, I really regret bringing Megan here now,
Ares muttered. Keras touched his shoulder again.
She will be fine. She will be well protected at the palace. The enemy will not attack here. It would be suicide with so many of Father's legions here now.
Their father had called back 3 legions. Close to 10,000 of his men would remain at the palace to protect it, while several elite groups from each legion would go with Keras and his brothers into battle. The garden was thick with them, and the palace had so many captains and other officers in it that it was hard to move around the corridors. Several of those officers stood around the map, as eager to get going as he was.
We have a kick-ass team.
Cal went to Ares and lightly boxed him on the arm.
No one is getting near Megan, Aiko, or Ava.
Milos is remaining here too,
Cass offered. Milos jumped on the map and scratched at it, sharpening his claws in a way that made his feelings perfectly clear.
Stop that,
Cass muttered, but the ginger and white Tom ignored her, kept clawing at a mountain and ripping chunks from it. Apparently, Milos was not happy about the arrangement.
What is a tiny cat going to do?
Thanatos jerked his chin towards it.
It is a scrawny thing.
Milos growled, the sound going from weak to a rumbling snarl as he grew, golden sleek fur rippling over his body as it transformed. Tawny feathered wings sprouted from his back, and a dark mane rippled down his neck, tufting from the top of his head and around his ears, too. When his shift was complete and he resembled a winged lion, Milos bared his 3 yellowing fangs at Thanatos on a mighty roar. The god of death held his hands up in front of him and pulled a face that said, "Fair enough." Milos furled his wings against his back. The map creaked beneath his weight, bowing slightly before he jumped off it.
The big bad man didn't mean it, Milos, baby.
Cass went after him as he loosed a long, low growl.
You are beautiful, strong.
Keras focused on the map again as Enyo came up beside him.
I have other news,
she said, and he glanced at her, and lingered as he found her looking at him.
My brother is coming now that he has heard that Iris and the others are involved. The 4 of them often rode into battle with him, and he isn't happy that they have betrayed Hades.
As much as Keras despised her brother, having the god of war on their side could only be a good thing. He could set aside his feelings about him, for now at least. If Iris isn't coming here, then where would she go? Cal's blue eyes roamed the map.
Somewhere she knows?
Diamond offered, and it hit Keras.
Not necessarily somewhere she knows.
He sought the realm, his gaze skipping over mountain ranges and deep valleys, until he found the one he was looking for. He pointed to it.
Somewhere she felt powerful, invincible.
My realm?
Nyx's voice gained an octave as she approached the map.
It does make sense.
Thanatos came to stand beside her, his enormous black wings shifting restlessly against his bare back.
We go there, then.
Nyx muttered something as she glared at her realm on the map, her navy to aqua eyes darkening. She wanted Iris to pay for her audacity. Another good thing. Having the goddess of night riled and out for blood, and having the battle take place in her own realm was sure to give her incentive to fight with all of her heart. Not much could stand against Nyx when she was in a rage. She teleported. Thanatos followed her. Keras grabbed his gauntlets and pulled them on as he turned to the officers.
Gather your men.
They all nodded, kept their heads bent as they backed off. They turned away from him, heading for the door. He flexed his crimson talons as he looked at his brothers.
Ready?
They all nodded. Keras took hold of Enyo's arm and stepped. Darkness embraced them, the thundering beat of his heart echoing in it as his mind raced and adrenaline flooded his veins. The uncertainty of what awaited them sending a sharp thrill laced with an edge of fear through him. They landed in the midst of chaos. Ennio tugged on his arm, yanking him to his left just as a blade whizzed past his head. The Valkyrie shrieked at him, her golden braids catching the light of the fireball that shot towards her. It struck her in her chest and launched her backwards into another of her breed who was fighting 3 men dressed in black armor edged with blue. Nyx's guards. Keras drew his sword and unleashed his shadows, let them tear through the weaker of the forces Iris had brought with her as he got his bearings. Ennio fought the Valkyrie as he scanned the battlefield and the grand palace beyond it. The 2 Valkyries near them weren't the only ones. Not only did Iris and her comrades have an army of hellspawn and other species of the underworld on her side, but she had at least 50 Valkyries. The blonde females were making fast work of Nyx's guards, decimating her forces despite being outnumbered 10-1. The Valkyries were the least of Keras's worries, though. Above him, eerie shrieks and cries echoed, and blood dripped down on him like light rain. Iris had convinced the Keras to join her side. The female death spirits flew on bloody wings, their white skin making them appear almost spectral against the dark sky. Near Keras, one of the guards went down and struggled to get back onto his feet. On a keening cry, a Keras swept down and landed on him, tearing at him with her talons, vile hunger flashing in her glowing white-blue eyes. Keras grabbed Ennio and shoved her forwards, away from the creature. It wouldn't attack anyone who wasn't bleeding, but he didn't want to risk it. "Well, fuck," Valen muttered as he joined them, casting a disgusted look at the Keer as she finished ripping the male to pieces and began feasting on him. "This is going to be fun." Fun wasn't the word Keras would have chosen. Around him, the men from his father's legions appeared, close to 1,000 in total. Nowhere near enough. "Everyone pick a Valkyrie and start working on figuring out her charm," Ares bellowed above the din of battle. "And watch for Keras," Keras added, because he was damned if he was going to lose any of his brothers or their women to the death spirits. As one, his brothers spread out. Diamond and Cass broke away to his east, Merrick and Katerina heading with them a short distance before they began moving further apart. Ares and Escher moved together, Valen tracking them for barely a few meters before he spotted a Valkyrie. Lightning shot down, flickering white-purple, and the female screamed as it struck her. Keras grabbed Cal before he could move. His youngest brother looked back at him. Just beyond him, Mirinda paused and pivoted to face them. "Find Meadow," Keras said. "We need to stop her from opening a gate." Cal and Mirinda nodded. "Not sure how easy finding her is going to be, though," Cal muttered as he scanned the battlefield. He had barely finished that sentence before shimmering colorful light glowed in the distance, closer to the imposing black palace. Then again, Cal grabbed Mirinda and stepped. Keras focused on working in tandem with Ennio, using his shadows to deal with any hellspawn who got too close to them as she battled one Valkyrie and he took on another. He blocked the female's blade with his own as she lunged at him, coming close enough that he could scan her arm for anything that looked as if it might be a charm. She pushed off and leaped backwards, distancing herself, and he summoned more shadows, ignoring the drain on his strength as he sent them shooting towards her. One managed to snake around her leg, and he used it to pull her back to him. She swung again, and he ducked, kicked off, and barreled into her stomach. She grunted as he slammed into her and lifted her feet off the ground, and hissed as he threw her onto her back on the ground and leaped on top of her. She slashed at him with her talons, and he was quick to teleport, narrowly avoiding being cut by her. Above him, 3 Keras cried out. Unhappy that he hadn't been injured? He looked back at the Valkyrie as she twisted away from him. Grinned. A small black stone had been sewn into the back of her short golden skirt. Keras lunged for it and managed to hook his fingers into the waistband of her skirt. He hauled her backwards as she hissed and snarled at him, and ripped the stone away from her armor as soon as he had an opening. He crushed it in his fist. His shadows tore from the black ground and burrowed into her flesh. She screamed as she went down. A scream that was echoed above him. Keras leaped away from her and didn't pause to watch as the Keer descended on the Valkyrie. The death spirits weren't picky, apparently. They didn't care whether an injured warrior belonged to his side or their one. They just wanted to feed. He fought to reach Ennio, blocking and slashing with his sword, cutting a path through the hellspawn who got in his way. A fist slammed into his chest, knocking him backwards the moment he was close to her. A sword followed it. Keras ducked as pain spread across his rib cage like fire and he fought to breathe. Moros advanced on him, not giving him a chance to recover. Shadows raced from behind Keras, rising in sharp spikes towards the god of doom. The male grinned as he cut at them with his sword, a blade that sliced straight through them. Keras gritted his teeth and cursed. He unleashed more shadows as he swept his own sword down by his side and launched at Moros. The black to scarlet-haired male still only wore minimal armor, a slatted skirt, boots, and vambraces, and a single onyx leather strap across his chest that held a pauldron on his left shoulder. It allowed the god to move faster, but at the same time it left him vulnerable. If Keras could get close enough to him and keep him distracted with sword attacks, he might be able to use his shadows to take the male down. He flicked a glance at Enyo to check on her. She had lost her helmet, but she had managed to dispatch the Valkyrie she had been fighting. She turned away from the fallen female and began moving back towards Keras, her silver sword a swift blur as she dealt with any hellspawn foolish enough to get in her way. 3 Valkyries landed between her and Keras. One of them targeted her. 2 came up behind Moros. Keras bared emerging fangs at them as he readied himself, flexing his fingers around his blade. Darkness surged through him and he shot towards the trio, shadows racing on his heels to pass him as he clashed with Moros. The ferocity of their swords meeting sent painful vibrations up his arm, numbing his hand for a moment. Moros clenched his teeth and shoved forwards, leaping backwards at the same time. The male barely set his foot down before he was coming at Keras again, his sword slicing through the air. Keras blocked it and growled as one of the Valkyries tried to get around behind him. His shadows snapped at her, driving her back again. She eyed them warily. Her comrade didn't. The second Valkyrie beat her wings and shot towards him, and he twisted away from Moros and raised his hand, commanding the shadows to form a wall between him and the Valkyrie. She shrieked as she hit it, but it didn't stop her. She blasted through the shadows and hit him hard, knocking him sideways and off balance. Enyo appeared behind her and grabbed her wing and yanked, flipping the female around and hurling her into the air. Moros lunged for her. Enyo pivoted and leaned backwards, narrowly avoiding the tip of his blade as it cut through the air at chest height. She brought her leg up, striking the male's hand with her foot, and he grunted as he barely kept hold of his sword. He snagged her ankle with his free hand and swung her up into the air. Keras snarled and stepped, grabbed her and teleported again, pulling her to safety. Or not. Moros came with them, landing hard in a clearing closer to the palace. Enyo rolled onto her feet and brought her sword up, slashing at the god, and Keras launched his shadows at the male as he got his bearings again. He grunted as someone struck him from behind, knocking him forwards, and growled as pain swept through his left side just above his hip. He glared down at the golden talons that pierced him, grabbed the Valkyrie's hand and tore it away from him, pivoting at the same time. He lunged forwards and cracked his forehead against hers, ripping a grunt from her. Above him, a Kyr shrieked. Keras raked talons across the Valkyrie's chest, slicing through the strap of her small dark gold bikini-style top and drawing blood. He shoved her away from him and sprang backwards, his heart hammering as wind beat against him, and blood splattered the shoulders of his black armor. His feint worked. Rather than attacking him, the Kyr targeted the Valkyrie. He spun away from them as they grappled, bringing his sword up as he called on his shadows, blocking the blow Moros had aimed at Enyo. She dropped to her knees and lashed out with her own blade, managed to cut just above Moros's knee before the male could dodge her. Around him the battle raged, the cries of the Kyries growing constant as the scent of blood grew thicker in the air. Keras couldn't see victory, not yet. Even with some of his father's legion and Nyx's army battling on their side, they were only a match for the enemy. Victory wasn't guaranteed. He had to do something to turn the tide in their favor. Talking down Moros would be a start. Enyo rolled and came up on her feet, forcing Moros to turn with her, giving Keras his back. He grinned as he kicked off, gripping the hilt of his blade with both hands, his gaze locked on the male's exposed back, grunted as his right shoulder jerked backwards and fire blazed in it. He stumbled, missing a step as he glanced at his shoulder, at the arrow sticking out of it. He blinked, cursed. Oisis. He gripped the silver shaft of the arrow and yanked it from his flesh, grunting again as the fire spread outwards, had his right arm shaking as pain rolled down it. His gaze darted over the battlefield. His heart thundered. Where was she? He couldn't see her anywhere. Off to his left, Valen bit out a ripe curse and went down. Keras stepped to him and growled as he found his brother clutching an arrow lodged in his left thigh. He crouched beside him and checked his brother over. It wasn't the only injury he had sustained. Someone had managed to cleave a great gash in the right side of his armor, too, and he was missing his left vambrace and gauntlet. I'm fine, Valen muttered. Keras yanked the arrow from his thigh, ripping a bellow from him. When Valen's breaths leveled out, he grumbled, Okay, I'm not fine. His brother clutched his thigh, but with his armor on, it was hard for him to stop the bleeding. You need to get patched up. Keras frowned at him when he shook his head. Valen, do as I order. Around them, lightning blazed from the sky, striking several Keras before it slammed into the ground forces, hitting 2 Valkyries who had been advancing on them. I can still fight. Valen ripped the leg of his armor away and grimaced as he inspected the wound. Where's Ares when you need him? Here. Ares' bass voice rolled over them and he stepped around Valen, his expression grim as he looked him over. You need to go home. Fuck you. Valen saluted him with his middle finger. Just cauterize this shit and fuck off. Ares dropped to his knees beside Valen and pressed 2 fingers to the wound on his thigh. Valen screamed as flames formed around the tips of Ares' fingers, and Keras took hold of him, supporting his back as he struggled against Ares' hold. When Ares released him, Valen sagged in Keras' arms, breathing hard. Ava digs scars, Valen murmured, sounding not quite with the world. Ava would prefer you back alive, Keras countered and eased Valen up so he was sitting again. He realized that Ares wasn't the only one who had fallen back when Valen had gone down. Escher, Merrick, and Katerina fought around them, keeping the enemy away from Valen. Not going home, Valen grumbled. You need me here. As if to illustrate his point, a bolt of lightning shot from the sky and struck a Valkyrie who had been coming up behind Escher, sending her flying away from him. Fine, but you stay with Ares. Keras stood and offered his hand to Valen. Valen gripped it and pulled himself onto his feet. Ares reaffixed his armor for him and then straightened, looking Keras in the eye. You need fixing too? Keras shook his head. It barely pierced my armor. We need to find where Oisis is, though. Somewhere high up, most likely, Merrick said. Glowing blue hexagons rippled across the air behind him, and a silver arrow bounced off them. Katerina swore in Catalan. Another arrow shot towards Merrick, and Keras hit it with his shadows, deflecting it. His gaze darted to where it had come from, the roof of the palace. Before he could step there and deal with her, Oisis disappeared. Track her down, Keras growled. On it. Escher teleported. Keras stepped again, returning to Enyo. Moros was gone. What happened? He blocked the sword a hellspawn swung at her, and the male went down screaming as his shadows tore into him. Enyo swiped the back of her hand across her brow, clearing not only sweat away. Blood trickled from the wound above her eye, dripping onto her cheek. He retreated. I think they are using the palace as a stronghold. Enyo wiped the blood from her cheek. Oisos was there. Maybe they teamed up. Keras lashed out at a hellspawn with his sword, catching the male across his chest as he fumbled his block. Blood spurted from the wound, and the male turned fearful eyes skyward. Enyo grabbed Keras and they kept moving, working in harmony to cut a path towards the palace. A bright burst of rainbow light snagged his attention, and he glanced off to his right as he reached the perimeter wall of the palace. A gate. The violet disk birthed another colorful ring of glyphs as he looked at it. A few meters away, Cal and Mirinda battled 2 Valkyries. Cal hit them with a blast of wind that tangled their wings and threw them high into the air, and Mirinda was waiting for them when they crashed to the ground, leaped on them and clawed at them, hissing and flashing fangs, her violet eyes shining brightly with battle hunger. As vicious as any Kier. It was still strange seeing the sweet and gentle Mari transform into a bloodthirsty fury. Mirinda sprang from the Valkyries, neither of which got up. She and his brother must have discovered their charms, the item that protected them. Mirinda made a fast beeline for Meadow as the blonde female held her hands out before her focus entirely on the gate as another ring formed, hovering a few feet above the black ground. Mirinda slammed into her back on a vicious hiss, knocking her through the forming gate, disturbing the rings. Meadow grunted and Mari gasped as she grappled with her her violet eyes widening as she jolted. A grin tugged at her lips. The ground beneath Keras bucked and shuddered, and Cal and several others who were near the forming gate fell over. Another fierce quake struck Keras, and he looked over his shoulder, watched as it rippled outwards like a shock wave. Miranda. This power came from her. By touching Meadow, she must have formed the cycle between them, had absorbed his father's power from her half-sister. In several places, great shards of onyx shot from the ground, and a deafening groan sounded as a huge streak of the land fell away. He quickly scanned the faces of everyone caught in the sudden collapse, their harrowing cries filling his ears as his heart raced, fear that one of his brothers would be caught up in the landslide gripping him hard. He didn't recognize any of the unfortunate souls who plummeted into the depths. Enyo grabbed his arm and pointed, and he looked there. Ares and Valen fought together, but they were slowly being separated. Far beyond them, ice shards and bursts of colorful light told him where Diamond and Cass were. The great black spears of earth were joined by smaller spikes off to Keras's left, where Merrick was fighting. He couldn't see Escher, but he could feel him, somewhere beyond the wall. Thanatos and Nyx were there too, battling someone powerful. He turned to Enyo and frowned when she wasn't there. He scoured the battle for her and growled when he spotted her a short distance away, fighting a Valkyrie and 4 Hellspawn. And something struck him. The enemy were working to split them up, forcing them to fight alone or with one other. An arrow whizzed past him, swiftly followed by another, and the darkness in his veins snarled for freedom as one hit its target, nailing Ares in the back of his shoulder. Valen noticed and struggled to reach him, but 2 Valkyries attacked him, one of them cutting across his arm as he raised it to summon his lightning. The second Valkyrie suddenly dropped to the ground, and Valen looked over his shoulder. Keras followed the line of his gaze. Escher. He stood on the thick wall of the palace, fending off a Kyr as he looked at Valen, blood covering the left side of his face and chest. A silver blur shot towards him. Lightning struck before it could hit him, so bright it dampened Keras's vision. He looked up to his right, seeking Oisis, deeply aware that he had to stop her. He spotted a cave high on the side of the mountain that loomed over Nyx's palace. She had to be hiding there. Before he could step to check it out, Callistos unleashed an agonized bellow that chilled Keras's blood. He whipped to face his youngest brother, growled as the Kyr he was desperately fighting lashed at him with sharp talons, slicing through his black armor and nicking his throat. Mari hissed and released Meadow, leaped on the female death spirit and ripped at her bloody wings. Keras rushed to Cal, his heart in his throat, the darkness growing stronger as he shoved his way through the enemy and his allies alike. He drew to a sharp halt as he reached his brother, dropped to his knees and pulled him carefully into his arms. Cal clutched his throat, blood pumping from between his fingers as he lifted weary blue eyes to meet Keras's gaze. Keras grew aware of the fight that raged around them, of his brothers as they desperately fought to turn the tide of the battle in their favor, all of them injured. The enemy were stronger than he had thought. They weren't going to win this unless they went all out, including him. He looked down at Cal, had never felt as responsible for the fate of this realm and his family as he did as that realization hit him. A strange stillness fell over him as Miranda took Cal from him, as Cass appeared beside him to tend to his brother. As he stood and looked at the battle, saw Merrick take a nasty hit as he tried to protect Katerina from a Valkyrie. He had to do something. He would do something. The night he had fought Enyo in Tokyo came flooding back. He had never felt as powerful as he had in that moment, but he had come dangerously close to losing his mind to the darker side of his blood, had almost been overwhelmed by it. It had been a violent struggle to bring himself back from the brink, and there had been moments when he had feared he wouldn't be strong enough to do it, that the darkness inside him was too powerful for him to defeat. Valen went down as he tried to reach Merrick, lightning crashing all around where he disappeared from view, and a great fireball blasted through the enemy towards him, Ares sprinting just behind it, desperation written in every tight line of his blood-stained face. Keras knew what he had to do. He removed his gauntlets and discarded them, emptiness flowing into him as he tossed them on the ground. He twisted his fingers around the black band on his wrist and snapped it. Power flowed into him, a surge that rocked him forwards and had the darkness within him growing agitated, pushing for freedom. Keras looked to his right, his gaze seeking Enyo, his strength, his heart, his everything. Sorrow was swift to fill him as he looked at her, as he soaked in the sight of her, regret that had lived inside him for centuries now. She cut down the Valkyrie she had been fighting and wiped her brow, froze and tensed, slowly looked across her shoulder in his direction. Her jade eyes locked with his.
I'm sorry,
he murmured, sure she wouldn't hear his words, but needing to tell her. He slipped his fingers beneath the black and silver bracelet she had made for him. Her eyes widened. She screamed.
No!
Lunged for him, desperately grabbing and shoving at anyone who stood between them. Keras closed his eyes, snapped the limiter, welcomed the darkness. It rushed into him on the crest of the sensation of power that surged through him, obliterated his consciousness. His final thought was his final fear. He wasn't coming back from this. Chapter 33. Keras was gone in a flash, disappeared before Enyo could reach him and stop him. She skidded to a halt where he had been, disturbing the ribbons of black smoke he had left behind, and dropped to her knees, scooped up the remains of his limiters and stared at them. The ground trembled ominously and the hairs on the back of her neck rose as Keras's power buffeted her, and a cold wind scoured the battlefield. She slowly lifted her eyes to the sky, to the obsidian clouds gathering above her. Crimson arcs of lightning chased across those clouds as they rapidly billowed outwards, their surface rolling like boiling liquid, and the power that pressed down on her grew stronger still as they descended towards her. Enyo closed her fingers over the tattered bracelets, unable to shake the fear that gripped her, fear she had seen in his eyes too. He wasn't strong enough to go all out like this and retain control of himself. In Tokyo, he had come dangerously close to losing himself to his darker side, and he had only broken one limiter then. Now he had removed both of them, had allowed the full force of his power to flood him, and his last words to her had been more than an apology. They had been a goodbye. She felt that deep in the heart that was breaking in her chest. He knew that unleashing his full power would destroy him, changing him into someone else, something he wouldn't come back from. He knew, and he had done it anyway, sacrificing himself so he could protect his brothers and win this war, sacrificing himself to save his family, to save her. Diamond and Cass appeared nearer. Diamond's pale blue eyes lifted to the clouds that hung low above them, still descending towards them. The witch came to her and crouched, touched the hand she clutched the bracelets in, and said,
Tell me what you need.
Enyo shut down her fear, cleared her mind and focused on the battle, because if they could help Keras, there was a chance she might be able to bring him back, as she had in Tokyo. She could reach him, but only if he wasn't allowed to fight alone. He wanted that, but she wouldn't allow it. She needed to be there with him, so he didn't need to go all out, so he didn't have to let the darkness completely consume him in order to win this war. She looked at Diamond and realized he wasn't alone now. His brother Ares was there too, together with Merrick and Katerina and Valen. Escher stood a short distance away, his blue eyes gaining a crimson corona as they locked in one direction, the one she could sense Keras was in, battling the Fury. He had retained enough sense to target the most dangerous of their foes at least, remaining on mission.
A barrier,
Enyo said as shadows began to spiral down from the clouds, scarlet lightning chasing around them and slamming into the earth when it was close enough to connect, shaking the ground beneath her.
I can cast one too. It will contain his power at least. I can cast one that will contain everyone, stopping them from escaping. But I cannot guarantee how long I can keep it going. I will need to constantly repair it.
Cassandra glanced at Diamond. I'll protect you while you maintain it. He dragged his gaze away from the clouds. If you need to tap me for strength, you do it. Valen stepped forwards. I'll help him.
What do you need from me?
Ares said, worry shining in his fiery eyes. Enyo looked from him to Merrick, Katerina, and Escher.
I need you all to work together to take down as many of the enemy as possible. The less Keras has to deal with himself, the better. If you can take down Iris or one of her comrades, do it.
What are you going to do?
Merrick looked her over, and she grew aware of her injuries, that she wasn't in peak condition and had expended much of her strength.
I'm going to try to bring him back.
Escher looked over his shoulder at her, concern written in every line of his face.
I want to help you.
You will be. Help me by helping him, Escher. Work with your brothers. Stay in close formation. Do not get separated.
Ares nodded, and his handsome face grew sober as he looked down at her.
Bring him back.
She stared up into his eyes, deeply aware of the responsibility he was placing on her shoulders, deeply aware of the hope all of Keras's brothers were pinning on her, and how devastated they would be if she failed. Enyo dipped her chin. A scarlet bolt of lightning struck the ground close to her and sent her flying. Debris bit into her legs as she sailed through the air. She landed hard and rolled, struggled to right herself, and grunted as she finally stopped. She immediately pushed onto her feet and looked in all directions, trying to find where she had been. Relief crashed over her as she spotted Merrick helping Ares onto his feet and saw that everyone was all right. Her senses sparked and she kicked off, narrowly avoiding another lightning strike. It hit a group of the enemy, decimating them. Enyo ran until she found a clearing and focused, summoning her power. She swept her hands out, felt the wave of power explode from her, and looked up. She couldn't see the barrier as it formed, but she could feel it. The cloud she had trapped inside it roiled, arcs of crimson chasing across them, spiraling down the shadowy tornadoes that tore across the land, sending people flying in all directions. She shifted her focus away from the brothers, singling out Keras. The clouds dropped lower, touching the ground in places, forming pockets of shadows that she avoided, aware that if she ran into one, it would steal her sight, leaving her vulnerable. Screams came from inside several of the writhing masses of shadows. She leaped as lightning struck off to her left, and a fissure shot across her path. Didn't dare to look down into the abyss as she sailed over it. She stumbled as she landed on the other side, picked her way over boulders and around impact craters.
He is going to destroy my entire realm, Nyx screamed, her fury palpable as Enyo passed her.
She didn't slow to help the goddess with Apate, just kept running, narrowing the distance between her and Keras. She sprinted past Thanatos as he rushed to help his mother with the goddess of deceit, wove her way through a battle between 5 of Hades' soldiers and a group of Hellspawn. Her heart shot into her throat as lightning struck them just as she cleared them, the percussion wave from it hitting her in the back and launching her forwards. She slammed into Cal, took him with her as she tumbled across the ground and landed on top of him.
Sorry.
She pushed off him and twisted, her gaze seeking Keras, blood thundering as she searched for him. A tiny orb of violet light hovered above the black ground a few meters from her. A gate. Beyond it, Mirinda fought like a wild thing, clawing and grappling with the other Fury. Blood covered the side of her face and matted her golden hair. The enemy Fury hadn't fared much better. Her left arm dangled limp at her side as she threw a right hook at Mirinda. Something hit Meadow in the back, knocking her forwards. A rock? Enyo grimaced. Not a rock, a severed head. Moros's lifeless eyes stared at her. Meadow turned to see what had hit her, and her hand flew to her mouth, her skin paling as she spotted the head on the ground close to her. Shadows swept around her and sent Mirinda flying. Cal disappeared in a swirl of black smoke, reappearing in Mirinda's path and catching her before he teleported again, appearing next to Enyo. He set Mirinda down and looked at Enyo, his breath sawing from his lips as his blue gaze demanded an explanation. She didn't need to give him one. Meadow burst from the shadows, held aloft by Keras, her legs kicking wildly as she scratched at his arm. His black claws sank into her throat as he lifted her higher, a twisted grin curling his lips to flash enormous fangs as he stared up at the Fury. Enyo grabbed Cal and Mirinda when they both went to move, holding them back. She stared at Keras, and he slowly turned his head towards her, his eyes locking with hers, eyes that were black around his scarlet pupils. Onyx tendrils spread across Meadow's ashen skin, flowing from the points where Keras's claws pierced her. He didn't take his eyes off Enyo as the Fury's struggles slowed, as those shadows crept outwards and downwards, heading for her chest.
Keras!
Enyo released Mirinda and held her hand out to him, moving slowly, not wanting to startle him. Mirinda launched at him on a feral snarl, evaded the blow he aimed at her, and seized his arm, desperately trying to pull it from the other Fury's throat.
Mari!
Cal wrestled free of Enyo's grip and lunged for her. Whether he had intended to pull her away from Meadow or beyond the reach of Keras was something Ennio would never find out. Keras backhanded Mirinda. She rocketed backwards, crashed into Cal, and sent him flying with her. The two of them landed in the middle of the group that were battling behind Ennio. Her gaze whipped back to Keras. His shadows swept up from his feet, curled over his shoulders, and rose into the air before they rushed downwards to spiral around him, covering both him and the Fury. Ennio kicked off, racing towards him as red lightning streaked from the black clouds, slamming into the earth all around the mass of shadows. A mass that dissipated to reveal only the Fury where she lay on the ground, cut to ribbons. Dead. Where had Keras gone? Her head snapped to her right when an entire section of the thick wall that surrounded the palace exploded. The stones of it sprayed the elegant black building, shattering windows and blasting holes in the walls. A feminine pained cry reached her ears above the din of battle. Ennio mustered her strength and teleported, appearing in the ruined garden of the palace, her eyes darting around as she sought Keras. They landed on a hole in the wall of the palace. She ran for it, threw herself into a slide across the flagstones as her senses blared a warning. She covered her head with her arms and curled inwards, shielding her vital organs as shadows tore through the air above her, snapping at her on their way past. Ennio shifted onto her front and lurched to her feet as soon as she stopped sliding, heading back the way she had come. Keras slammed Oisis into the perimeter wall, causing an impact crater 15 feet wide and fracturing stones for at least twice that. Blood burst from the fair-haired female's lips, a choked cry following it as Keras gripped something silver and twisted it, yanked it free, and plunged it deep into her chest again. An arrow. He was brutal as he ripped the shattered Corinthian helmet from her hair and smashed it into her face, a low growl rumbling from him. She took 3 hard blows before she managed to block him. Oisis's blue eyes darkened as she seized the hand he held the arrow in, her face contorting as she wrestled with him, struggling to stop him from stabbing her again. Keras grunted and growled, leaned into her, and drove forwards. The goddess kneed him between the legs, causing him to loosen his grip on her. She was quick to twist the arrow from his grip and plunge it into his chest. Ennio kicked off, shooting through the air in her direction, her blood blazing as she drew her sword and aimed it at the female. Before she could land a blow, an arm broke through the shattered wall behind Oisis, wrapped around the front of her throat, and dragged her backwards through it. The rest of the wall crumbled, stealing her from view, something that had Keras roaring. He stepped. Ennio leaped onto the fallen stones. Below her, Thanatos twisted Oisis to face him, his fiery blue eyes glowing in the darkness. He grabbed the front of her breastplate and lifted her.
You will pay for the shame you have brought upon your family.
Thanatos's deep voice rolled over the battlefield. He didn't get the chance to mete out justice to his youngest sister. Keras slammed into her, stealing her from him, disappearing in a swirl of black smoke. When he reappeared a short distance away, barely a split second later, Oisis hung limp from his left hand, the lower half of her body dragging along the ground as his black eyes scoured the fray. He snarled, his gaze landing on Nyx where she stood over the body of Apate, threw Oisis at the goddess of night. Nyx was quick to dodge. She turned murderous eyes on Keras. Keras bared his fangs at her. For a moment, he looked as if he would attack her too, but then his head whipped to his right towards the palace. His scarlet pupils narrowed. Ennio knew who he had sensed. Iris. She tried to beat him to the raven-haired goddess, but the moment her golden eyes locked on Ennio, 5 Keras descended on her. Ennio grunted as she raised her arms and tried to block them, as fire lashed at her with each vicious slash of their claws over her exposed skin. Thanatos hurried to her, managed to cut down one Keer with a mighty swipe of his black broadsword, giving her an opening to reach for her own weapon. She gave him her back, silently thanking him whenever he shielded her with his wings, taking a blow meant for her.
You can reach him, I presume,
Thanatos growled.
We need Iris alive.
I know,
she bit out. Hades would want someone to punish for all of this. If she failed in her mission to reach Keras and pull him back from the darkness, she feared she would be the one spending the rest of her days in Tartarus. She sliced through the thigh of a Keer as it tried to move away from her, followed it with a thrust of her blade. Her sword plunged into the female's side, and Ennio tugged her forwards with it, seized hold of her arm, and held her in place as she yanked her sword free. She shoved the Keer back and spun, bringing her sword up at the same time, cutting clean through her neck.
That was the last of them.
Thanatos broke away from her, heading for the palace. She kicked off in that direction, too. Iris's twin daggers flashed brightly as she lashed out at Keras, driving him back, keeping some distance between them, her golden eyes wild and her desperation tainting the air. It was no use. Keras grinned and shadows lunged for the goddess. She swiped at them, managing to cut the pointed tips of several of them, but there were too many. She screamed as they plunged into her legs, as red arcs of lightning chased up them and coursed through her, and lost her grip on one of her daggers. As the arcs faded, she weakly slashed at Keras with her one remaining blade, her action sluggish as he advanced on her. Iris's face scrunched up, and she grunted as she hurled the dagger at him.
No!
Enyo's heart shot into her mouth as it embedded in his chest, knocking him back several steps. Keras looked down at it, his black eyes narrowing as he frowned. He lifted his hand with visible effort and fumbled with the blade, taking several attempts to pull it free of his armor. It came out glistening red. He turned to glare on Iris. She screamed as his shadows ripped into her legs.
Stop!
Thanatos barked and beat his wings, shot towards Keras and grabbed hold of him. Keras roared and attacked him, using Iris's blade against the god of death. He slashed at Thanatos's bare chest, catching him across his left pectoral, leaving a deep diagonal groove that rapidly spilled crimson. Thanatos swore. Enyo cursed too as she felt her barrier go down. She didn't have enough energy left to cast another one. She glanced at the horizon and loosed another curse when she saw that her barrier wasn't the only one that had gone down. Cassandra's had too. Iris clawed at the shadows, tears streaming down her face as she desperately tried to free herself. Keras continued to battle Thanatos, managed to land more blows on him with the dagger, cutting across his arm and his hip. Thanatos was pulling his punches. A huge mistake.
We need her alive.
Thanatos growled and dodged backwards as Keras swiped at him. Keras grinned as the god of death unwittingly backed into waiting shadows. They snaked around his legs and rapidly rose to seize hold of his wings, too, pinning him in place. Thanatos twisted, trying to break free of them.
We must take Iris to Tartarus for your father, Keras.
Enyo ran up behind Keras and grabbed him, hauling him backwards just as he lunged forwards with the blade, stopping him from stabbing Thanatos.
Keras, listen to me.
She grunted as he elbowed her in the sternum, her breath seizing in her throat as it closed. He easily broke free of her and thrust the dagger at Thanatos's chest. He meant to kill him. A golden blade swept upwards, knocking the dagger from Keras's grip and sending it flying into the air. She couldn't believe her eyes as her brother stepped between Keras and Thanatos, his blue eyes darker than she had ever seen them as his fair eyebrows pinched hard.
Turning on your own side,
Ares spat and lowered his sword to his side.
Even I know that is beneath you.
Keras bared fangs at him. Her brother smiled slowly.
You wish to fight me? Nothing has changed then.
Ares lifted his free hand, the light of the crimson bolts of electricity that struck the ground around them bouncing off the gold plate of his vambraces and his breastplate, and turning his heavy blue cloak a strange shade of purple. He crooked a finger at Keras. No, she couldn't let them fight. She couldn't bear it.
Brother,
she said, but he wasn't listening. Didn't take his blue eyes off Keras as he spread his feet shoulder-width apart. She looked at Keras instead.
Keras, please.
Keras tossed a snarl over his shoulder and launched at her brother. She didn't want to watch as they clashed, as Ares jammed an elbow into Keras's face and got a fist in his throat in return. Thanatos finished freeing himself of the shadows now that Keras was distracted. The mountain of a god twisted away from the fight and grabbed Iris, bundled her up into his arms and beat his wings, lifting into the air with her. Keras roared as he noticed. Shadows barraged her brother and Keras broke past them, stepped but didn't teleport. Black ribbons swirled from his shoulders and he twisted and turned, growled as he took in his surroundings. He was too weak to teleport. Ares slammed into his back, his golden armor a stark contrast against Keras's black armor, light against darkness. Her brother wrapped an arm around his neck and pulled backwards, gripping his wrist to choke Keras.
You are being unreasonable,
Ares muttered. Keras smashed a fist into his groin. Ares grunted and released him, staggered backwards as he clutched himself and glared at Keras.
Now you are really being unreasonable.
Calm yourself, Keras. Listen to my voice.
Enyo rushed to him but didn't reach him before he kicked off and collided with Ares again. Her brother unleashed a frustrated growl as Keras grabbed his golden hair, fisting it hard, and shoved his head down. Ares grunted as Keras kneed him in the face and tossed him away again, sending him stumbling backwards once more. Her brother braced a foot behind him, recovered swiftly, and lunged forwards, slashing at Keras with his sword, forcing Keras to block. The two of them clashed again, harder this time, each strike of their blades ringing in the thick air as she looked for an opening in which she could reach Keras and grew aware of something. Her brother was trying to wear him out. He was trying to push Keras to his limit so he would be weakened, was stealing all of his focus to keep everyone else safe, and so she could have a chance to reach him without being able to lash out at her. Enyo saw an opening and forced herself to remain where she was, to trust her brother not to hurt Keras. She prayed that Keras wouldn't hurt him either, monitored him closely as he sent a wave of shadows at her brother, and Ares dodged them all, swept around behind him, and kicked him in the back. Keras slammed face first into the black ground and was slow to push himself up. His black hair brushed his forehead as he shook his head, as he frowned and gritted his teeth. He lumbered back onto his feet and twisted towards Ares, a vicious snarl peeling from his lips. Shadows suddenly shot up from the ground, wrapped around Ares, and hurled him.
Ares!
She flinched as he hit the ground hard, leaving an impact crater. Keras's eyes narrowed on her brother as he struggled to recover from the blow. A smile curled his lips. Shadows raced down from the sky and rose from the black earth in front of Keras. They shot towards her brother in a thick black beam. No. Enyo hurled herself into their path, her heart beating at a dizzying pace and fear rushing through her as she braced herself. Before the shadows could strike her down instead of her brother, Ares grabbed her and shoved her forwards, twisting with her. He pushed her and she hit the ground, gasped as she twisted, fearing the worst as he bellowed. The black tendrils tore at him, ripping at his armor, cleaving long gashes in it. He glanced at her as the shadows reached for her, warmth and worry in his blue eyes, and sprinted away from her, taking the shadows with him before they could attack her, protecting her. A shiver danced down her spine and over her arms. Keras had told her that he had seen that her brother loved her, and she hadn't believed him at the time, because she had never witnessed it for herself. She could see it now, though, as he placed himself between Keras and her, as he fought to free himself of the shadows and battled to keep them from her as they kept reaching for her. When he failed to free himself of the shadows, he narrowed his blue eyes on Keras. He teleported and grabbed Keras by his shoulder, ripping a scream from him as he dug his fingers into the wound on it. He pivoted, hurling him across the battlefield, away from everyone. Her heart lunged into her throat as Keras hit the ground, as he tumbled across it, kicking dust up into the air. He was still when he finally stopped in a wide clearing near the crumbling wall that surrounded the palace. Too still. She pushed onto her feet, her brow furrowing and heart screaming at her to go to him. Someone grabbed her arm in a bruising grip. She looked over her shoulder at her brother. He shook his head.
Do not. He is too dangerous.
His blue eyes shifted from her to Keras, the worry in them building. She looked there too, the need to go to him only growing as she watched him lumber onto his feet and stagger around, as his brothers approached him and he turned on them, lashing out at them with shadows and claws and baring his fangs. She calmly placed her hand on her brother's, eased it from her arm, and put on a brave face when he frowned at her.
I will be fine,
she whispered, not wholly believing that. But she had to do something. Keras caught Merrick hard with his shadows, taking him down, and Katerina rushed to him, forming a barrier that didn't last a second against the shadows. They shot towards both Katerina and Merrick. A pale green bubble appeared over them and the shadows bounced off it. Keras growled and shook his head, bared his fangs, and attacked the barrier, darkness washing across his features as he savagely clawed at it and struck it with his shadows. She walked towards him, mustering her courage, nursing the seed of hope that remained in her heart. She wasn't afraid of Keras. He would never hurt her. She kept telling herself that as she cautiously approached him, as he gave up trying to break through the barrier and viciously growled and snapped fangs at his brothers whenever they drew too close to him.
Keras,
she whispered as he dug his hands into his black hair and staggered away from his brothers. He stilled and looked at her. She smiled for him.
Listen to my voice.
She edged closer.
Come back to me.
He bared fangs at her. His scarlet pupils brightened. Lightning struck just behind her, the heat of it searing her back. A warning shot. She couldn't heed it. She had to reach him and bring him back. She needed him back. She ignored everyone around her, narrowed the world down to only them as she lifted her hands and took another slow step towards him.
I love you, Keras,
she murmured, feeling that love flowing through every inch of her to give her strength and the courage she badly needed.
I have always loved you.
She risked another step, flinched as another bolt of lightning struck close to her, shaking the ground, and Keras roared at her. She opened her eyes again and locked them with his.
I have loved you forever, and I will love you forevermore. I need you, Keras. I waited so long to be with you, and I will not give up on you now. I will not give up on us.
His black eyes softened, hardened a heartbeat later as he launched at her, too fast for her to dodge. He seized her by her throat and snarled in her face, his scarlet pupils narrowing as he sneered at her. She wasn't afraid of him. She lifted her hands, ignoring how he growled and snapped his fangs at them.
You kept me waiting for so long,
she husked.
Do not make me wait any longer for that forever I have always wanted with you.
She edged her hands up to his face, her gaze locked with his. He roared in her face, lunged at her hand with his teeth. Rage poured through her, threatening to shatter her hope as he tightened his grip on her throat. She was done being gentle with him. She had been right in Tokyo. She needed to be strong with him, firm and unyielding. Enyo grabbed his wrist with both hands.
Kill me or come back to me, because I will not give up on you.
Chapter 34. The air burst from Enyo's lungs as Keras twisted with her and slammed her into the ground. Pain exploded down the length of her spine and stars winked across her vision. She choked as he pressed down on her throat, stared into the crimson abyss of his pupils and tightened her grip on his arm. Fear crowded her heart, flowed through her veins and stole her strength as she lay beneath him, desperately trying to prise his hand from her throat. He bore down on her, growling in her face. Beneath her, the earth warmed. She edged her gaze to her right as color bloomed there, couldn't believe her eyes as a meadow sprung up around them. Strength flowed into her, seemed to come from the earth itself, filling her up just as the last of hers had left her. Enyo pushed back against the fear and looked at Keras again. He snarled at her and his claws pressed into her throat, cold spreading outwards from them.
Look at me,
she whispered, trying to keep his eyes on hers, not hiding the love she felt for him as she loosened her hold on his arm and forced herself to relax beneath him.
I do not want to hurt you. I am not a threat to you. I love you, Keras. I only want you to come back to me.
His black eyes leaped between hers. He jerked his head up and roared, deafening her, and she choked as he tightened his grip again, crushing her throat. Whoever had dared to move closer to him wisely backed off. As the ringing in her ears faded, she recognized her brother's voice.
Stay back,
she wheezed, fearing what might happen if anyone tried to get near Keras. She didn't want him to hurt her brother. She didn't want him to hurt his own family. She feared he would as she looked into his eyes, not recognizing the male staring back at her. He was too far gone to discern friend from foe, his injuries and exhaustion pushing him to lash out at anyone who got too close to him. He was trying to protect himself. She could use the awakening of that instinct in him to her advantage. She had promised to bring him back, and she intended to do just that. She gathered her strength again and lifted her hands, flinched when he snapped fangs at her left one and caught her this time. Blood bloomed in the line of the cut. He stilled, his eyes leaping to hers, and for the first time she had hope.
You know me, Keras,
she murmured to him, trying to keep his focus on her, fearing he would bolt and aware she couldn't let that happen. The darkness's hold on him was strong, and it would take too long to find him if he made a break for it. She had to keep him with her. He twitched, his gaze jumping up and then left, and this close to him she could sense his rage, his fear. He clutched her throat and glared at someone, tensing and hunkering down as if he was going to spring at them. Enyo gently placed her hand on his wrist, and he glanced at her, his gaze colliding with hers and lingering as she stroked him. This time, she only held his focus for a second. His gaze darted back to whoever was off to her left, and he flashed fangs. She edged her eyes in that direction. Thanatos. He had returned from taking Iris to Tartarus.
Can you please take your mother and inform Hades of what has happened?
Each word was a struggle, but she somehow managed it. Thanatos nodded and took hold of Nyx, and they disappeared. Keras's grip on her throat eased, and she relaxed again, glad she had read him right, and he had wanted Thanatos away from her. This deep in his darker side, he no doubt viewed Thanatos as a threat. Not to him physically, but as a rival for her affection. The darker part of him had been in control at the banquet, was no doubt reminding Keras that Thanatos had commented on her dress and her looks, stirring his need to keep her with him. She also felt that same darkness was provoking black thoughts about her brother trying to take her from him. She needed to show him that she didn't want anyone else or want to be anywhere else. She only wanted him. She only needed him, and that need ran deep. She needed to bring him back to her.
Keras?
He frowned at her, confusion flickering in his black eyes.
That's your name, Keras.
She smiled for him and tried to think of something to say that would remind him of who he was and might bring him back.
Do you remember what you said to me in the garden of your home?
His frown deepened.
You told me that it has always been me, from the moment you met me. Remember?
She searched his eyes, hoping to see a glimmer of recognition in them. When she found nothing, she continued, aware this was going to get them both into some trouble.
You told me that the only reason you have never fought my brother is because you knew it would kill me too. You said that you couldn't hurt me like that.
His grip loosened further, and he frowned down at his hand on her throat.
You asked me to live with you.
Tears lined her lashes as she gazed up at him.
I want that so much, Keras. I want a future with you. Do you want a future with me too?
He didn't answer her, but then she hadn't expected him to.
We can have it now,
she whispered, her brow furrowing as she slowly lifted her hands, warmth welling up inside her.
It's over now. It's over. Your father is safe. The realm is safe. You can return home, and we can have that life we have been waiting for all these centuries. We can be together.
Tears filled his eyes as they darted between hers. Enyo risked it. She framed his face and lured him down to her. Kissed him. He was still against her, and her hope wavered. But then he growled and slid his hand around her nape, yanked her up to him and crushed her to his chest as he kissed her, holding her so hard that she couldn't breathe. She sank into the kiss, not caring that he was hurting her, only caring that she was reaching him, on the verge of bringing him back. Someone moved. Keras broke the kiss and snarled at them as he held her to him. Shock swept through her as he teleported with her, and a flicker of fear lit her veins as they landed and she looked around her at a cavern. She didn't recognize it. Veins of gold glittered in the black rock and threaded the stalactites that hung from the ceiling above a dark pool that shone with glowing blue dots. Those dots moved, swimming in the clear water, their gentle light enough to allow her to see how far the cavern extended in all directions. It was huge, with only a small opening at one end. Keras staggered to the wall near the pool and collapsed to his knees, breathing hard and trembling violently. Damn him. He shouldn't have teleported her when he was already weak. The strain on his body must have been phenomenal. She was surprised he was still conscious. She rushed to him, expecting him to snarl at her. He cast her a desperate and fearful look, and her heart melted for him when she realized what he was thinking. Rather than taking hold of him, Enyo sat with her back against the wall, between him and the pool, and looked into his eyes.
Do not worry. I will not take you anywhere, and I will not go anywhere.
He had brought her here because he was feeling protective and possessive of her, had needed her away from other males while he was weak, unable to defend her. He had needed her away from her brother so he couldn't take her from him. Teleporting her here had been his way of keeping her to himself. A reckless and foolish way, but beautiful too. It strengthened her hope that she could bring him back to her. She held her hand out to him and cupped his cheek.
I will stay right here with you, because this is the only place in all the realms I want to be.
She patted her thighs with her other hand. He settled on his left side with his head on them and his back to her. She stroked his dirty black hair, gazing down at him as she murmured softly to him.
Rest now. I have you. I will watch over you. No one will take you from me.
It seemed to calm him. His eyes slipped shut and his breathing leveled out almost instantly, his weight comforting against her as he trusted her and fell asleep. Enyo kept stroking his hair. She would keep her vow. She would watch over him while he was vulnerable, sleeping to heal his extensive injuries. It would cause her own injuries to heal slower, but she didn't care. Giving Keras back his strength was more important. He needed it in order to fight his darker side and claw his way back to her. When she was sure he wouldn't wake, she leaned to her right and reached into the waist of her skirt. She pulled the 2 broken limiters from a small pocket on the inside of the thick band and frowned at them. It was going to be some time before Keras learned to cope with his power without help, and she was deeply aware how much he needed the help of his limiters, and how much the ones she had woven for him meant to him. So rather than waiting for new ones to be given to him when he returned home, she worked to weave the bracelet she had made for him with the one from his parents, forming them into a new limiter. When it was done, she lifted it to her lips and kissed it, and then slipped it onto his right wrist. She stroked her finger over it and then the ring on his thumb, and then skimmed the backs of her fingers across his cheek, as she ignored the fatigue that washed through her, made her head and her eyelids feel heavy. She wasn't sure how much time passed as she sat there with him, lost track of it as she gazed down at him, on high alert despite her own need to sleep. A pebble rolled across the ground, tumbling towards her from the far end of the cave. She tensed, her gaze snapping up, adrenaline flooding her aching body as her gaze scoured the darkness there. It rushed out of her together with her strength as she locked gazes with the intruder. Soft, tender green eyes fell to the god Enyo protected. Persephone stepped out of the gloom, drifting towards her, flowers blooming in the wake of her bare feet. When she reached Enyo, she gathered the layers of her black dress and lifted them, sank to her knees beside Keras and stroked his hair.
He always used to come here whenever he was angry about something,
Persephone murmured, her voice a warm caress that eased Enyo, had her lowering her guard and finally relaxing. Nothing would happen to Keras now. Persephone would see to that. She would protect him with Enyo. The queen of the underworld tilted her head and studied her son's face, her fall of scarlet hair swaying from her slight shoulders as she leaned towards him.
He thinks no one knows about this place.
Persephone lifted her emerald eyes to lock with Enyo's.
A mother knows everything.
It struck Enyo that his mother had always known about this side of his nature too, this darkness that could so easily control him and take him away from everyone he loved. The goddess shifted into a more comfortable position, tucking her legs beside her hip, and her gaze roamed back to Keras.
I shall let you into a secret. The rumors of Hades are true. There is another side to my husband, a side I once had to tame.
Tame? Enyo frowned. Persephone glanced up at her.
I am the leash on Hades' darker side, the sole thing that can keep it in check and stop him from losing control. That is the real reason why I am always with him, why I rarely leave his side. Without me near him, the darkness so easily overwhelms him. The tale about the seasons being the reason you remain with Hades is a lie?
Enyo found that difficult to believe. She had witnessed how the goddess could cause the seasons in the mortal world to spin out of control. She frowned again. Although that only happened when it was autumn or winter, the months in which nature grew dormant. The tale said Persephone could leave her husband during spring and summer, yet she rarely did. Enyo had always thought it was because she had a family with him, loved him and her children, and preferred to remain with them. She had never imagined that it was because her being apart from Hades caused the god king to grow dark. Persephone's eyes grew serious as she stared at Enyo.
You are the leash on Keras's darker nature.
The goddess's tone matched her expression, and it was strange to hear her voice holding such a stern edge when normally it was light and breezy, filled with warmth and tenderness. It softened again almost instantly, dropping to a whisper as she lowered her gaze to Keras.
I would understand if...
Enyo shook her head and cut her off.
I love Keras with all my heart, and I always have. I am not going anywhere. We have spent too many days apart in our lives. I never want to leave his side again.
Relief washed across Persephone's delicate features, lifting the somberness from her eyes. She stroked her son's brow.
Rest now. Heal well. I will tell your father you are safe. I will tell your brothers you will come back to us. They all worry so much about you.
Persephone glanced at her one last time, her green gaze holding hope and affection, and then she was gone. A strange feeling stirred inside Enyo, warmth that bloomed in her heart and that she found difficult to define. Love? She felt loved, but not in the way she did whenever Keras looked at her. This was different, because the look Persephone had given her was one of motherly love. The love of a parent? She had never known her mother, couldn't recall her, and had been raised by her brother. She had never known a mother's love, but now she felt as if she did, and it was a wonderful, warm feeling that buoyed her and gave her strength. Enyo lowered her hand, skimming it down Keras's arm, over the cool plates of his armor. She stopped when she reached his hand, stroked her fingers over the ring he wore on his thumb again.
I love you, Keras,
she whispered as she gazed at it, building courage that took effort even though he was asleep and wouldn't hear her.
I meant to give you this as a token of that love. I wish I had been brave enough. I am sorry I wasn't.
She would make up for that. She would be brave now, facing the darkness in him as Persephone must have with Hades all those centuries ago. She would help him tame it, doing all in her power to give him control over it. Because he was hers now, and she meant to keep him. Forever. Chapter 35. Keras had a dry mouth and one hell of a headache. He groaned and shifted to get more comfortable on his bed. A bed that moved and squeaked, the feminine sound drawing a frown from him.
Enyo?
He croaked, sure she hadn't been the one to make such a sound, but he could smell her now his senses were coming back online. He cracked his gritty eyes open, squinted as they watered, and blinked, trying to clear his vision. A lot of golden, smooth skin greeted him. He swallowed hard, shot into an upright position, and regretted it when his head turned. He planted a hand against his forehead and grimaced.
You shouldn't move so quickly. You are still healing.
Enyo's hand fluttered over his chest, touching bare skin. He looked down at her hands, wanted to groan for a different reason as he saw them resting on his chest, one on each pectoral. She snatched them back.
I had to check your injuries, and you did not seem comfortable in your armor.
It hit him that he had been sleeping on her thighs, using them as his pillow, and guilt flooded him as he lifted his gaze to her face. She looked tired, dark circles around her eyes. He frowned as he recalled her saying something to him, something about watching over him while he healed. Gods, he was selfish. Her own injuries were still healing while his were gone. She must have sat for hours with him, tending to him, keeping him safe. He wasn't sure what to say, not when he remembered other things, like attacking her. He cast his gaze down at his knees, his right eyebrow arching as he saw they were bare too. At least she had left him in his underwear. He shoved aside the urge to mention how naked he was and focused on apologizing to her, only he couldn't put together a good enough one to make up for what he had done.
I'm sorry.
It sounded weak to his ears, but Enyo smiled at him, the look in her pale green eyes telling him that it was enough for her. He took in his surroundings and frowned as he recognized them. It had been centuries since he had seen this place, a cavern he had found as a youth during his trial, one that had become his sanctuary in the years that had followed. He had never brought anyone here before.
What happened?
His gaze drifted over the surface of the pool, watching the glowing bugs as they whirled and danced, as fascinated by them now as he had been when he had first seen them. Although part of his current fascination with them was because he couldn't bring himself to look at Ennio, not when fear was building inside him. Sketchy memories of what had come after he had broken his limiters surfacing in his mind. They were a jumble, but he recalled a few things that had shame and guilt sweeping through him again. He looked at Ennio, desperate to ask her something but afraid of her answer.
Everyone is fine,
she whispered and shuffled closer to him, picked up the dark blanket that had pooled around him and pulled it up, draping it over his shoulders.
We won because of you. But if you ever do something so reckless again—
Tears filled her eyes and she bit her lip. He cursed himself for making her cry, self-loathing filling him as he reached for her. She welcomed his touch, let him brush his thumb across her cheek to clear her tears away, even let him linger with his palm on her as he looked into her eyes. He didn't deserve her. His gaze fell to her throat. His hand dropped from her face. He didn't deserve to touch her. She had every right to be angry, as furious with him as he was with himself. He had hurt her again, had attacked her and others, had been consumed by vile needs that had been seductive, had almost lured him into acting them out. Ennio took hold of his hand and brought it back to her face, and gods, that utterly undid him. Together with the bracelet he noticed on his wrist, one that appeared to have been woven from the two he had broken. It was strong, helping him control his power as he slowly regained his strength. A gift from Ennio. A gift filled with love that warmed him to his soul. He slid his hand around her nape and pulled her to him, wrapped her in his arms and thanked the fates they had given him Ennio. A beautiful, strong, brave, and kind female to call his own. The light to his darkness. She wrapped her arms around him and held him. Just held him. No words, no judgment. Just warmth, love. It poured into him, filled him with that light he always saw in her, chasing back the remnants of darkness and freeing him of its hold. Keras drew back and kissed her, softly, tenderly, with all the love he felt for her, an apology for what he had done, and a plea to her to forgive him, to stay with him, rolled into one. She framed his face with her palms and kissed him for a moment. But then she broke away from him and fear rushed through him, chilling his blood. Only she didn't look as if she was going to leave him. She reached to her left and he frowned as she picked something up and held it out to him. A neat stack of clothes, black slacks, black shirt.
Your mother brought them.
His eyes widened.
Mother knows about this place.
She nodded.
A mother knows everything, apparently.
He took the clothes from her, looked at them, and then back into her eyes. She read the question in them.
She came here a few times, first to see you were safe and speak with me, and then she brought me food, a blanket, and news from the palace, and then she returned a final time to bring you clothes, possibly because she found you undressed the second time.
A blush heated her cheeks, because his mother had seen she had stripped him to his underwear. He imagined his mother was aware they had done far more wicked things than Ennio seeing him almost naked while he had been in a deep healing sleep. There was no reason for his goddess to be embarrassed. He dressed anyway. He didn't trust his legs yet, so he sat on the blanket as he pulled his trousers on.
Is father well?
He tugged the trousers over his backside and fastened them. She nodded.
Everyone has returned to the palace. Thanatos has taken Iris to Tartarus to await trial.
Iris. Keras had wanted to kill her too. He recalled that. He had wanted to kill Thanatos for trying to take her from him. He also remembered trying to kill Ennio's brother. He grimaced. She noticed it.
I'm sorry about attacking your brother.
He pulled his shirt on. She shook her head.
Don't be. I think he was enjoying it until I got in the way. He probably wants a rematch in the arena.
It had been centuries since Keras had set foot in the arena in Olympus, and he had no plans to enter at any time in the near future, even when he wanted a rematch with her brother, too. He paused halfway through buttoning his black shirt and looked at her. Although he had the feeling he didn't have to fight for her anymore, he had the feeling that she really was his and she always would be.
How long was I out?
He slipped another button through the hole.
Perhaps a little over a day.
He froze.
A day?
He could only imagine how worried his family was. Ennio or his mother could have taken him home at any time, but they hadn't. Ennio had kept her promise to stay in this sanctuary, to remain with him, to watch over him. He was eternally grateful for that. He could remember something about when he had brought her here. He had feared he would lose his fragile hold on his lighter side if she took him anywhere near another male. The need to protect her, to keep her as his and his alone, had been strong, was still strong. But his will was stronger now, his mind and heart clear. She was his, and the darker side of him didn't need to worry about losing her. She would always be his.
We should return.
Because he was tired of worrying people all the time. He had done that far too much over the last 2 centuries. She stood and held her hand out to him, and he slipped his into it. She hauled him up and into a teleport before he could use his own ability to take her to the palace. Another sign of her love for him that warmed his heart and soothed his darker side. She didn't want him to weaken himself. They landed just outside the main palace, and she helped him inside. As they made their way towards his father's bedchamber, he grew aware of something. The building was eerily quiet. He focused his senses, frowned when he felt only Ennio on them.
Something isn't right,
Ennio whispered. He glanced at her.
Where is everyone?
A shiver trickled down his spine as he tried again and sensed only Ennio. Even the guards who were normally stationed around the grounds were gone. A sense of foreboding filled him, had him moving faster as they neared the bedchamber. He shoved the door open and stilled. It was empty. He seized hold of Ennio's wrist and stepped, was walking as they came out of the teleport in front of his own home. His pace picked up, his heart thundering as he stretched his senses outwards, and that same eerie stillness greeted him. Ennio slipped her hand into his as they rushed into his palace and through it, checking everywhere. Finding no one. Had something happened while he had been absent? His gaze shot to Ennio.
When was the last time Mother visited?
She pulled a thoughtful face.
A few hours ago, maybe 5.
A lot could happen in 5 hours. He spun on his heel, went to a window, and desperately scoured the grounds, seeking a sign of life. What if Iris had managed to escape Tartarus? Horrific images filled his mind, chilling his heart. He mustered his strength and stepped again. Landed in the grounds of his brother Ares' palace, fearing what he might find. He stopped dead when a female bellowed, the sound pure agony. Keras grabbed Ennio and rushed towards the palace, dragging her along behind him as his heart thundered. Adrenaline spiking and the darkness surged. Another piercing scream cut through the tense silence as he entered the vestibule. His head jerked up to his right and he ran in that direction, his shadows racing ahead of him. He mounted the stairs 2 at a time and sprinted towards the end of the corridor, towards his brother's master bedroom. He shouldered the door open, his shadows at the ready to strike down whoever was attacking his family. Froze. It wasn't quite the bloodbath he had expected. Persephone, Iko, and Cassandra all turned to look at him, every single one of them looking ready to hit him for bursting into the room. Ares stood with his back to him just in front of him, obscuring his view of the bed. As his brother turned towards him, a shiver tripped down Keras' spine. There, tucked in his brother's thickly muscled arms, was a tiny squirming bundle wrapped in pink cloth spotted with flowers.
I thought...
Keras swallowed hard, couldn't take his eyes off the squalling babe as she wriggled, fighting her father's tender hold.
Yeah, she's a little early. Mother says stress induced it. I feel like a bit of a dick now.
Ares' eyes misted up, but there was worry in their dark depths. Keras couldn't help but join him. He had meant to say that he had thought something terrible had happened when he hadn't been able to find anyone, but he didn't have the heart to tell his brother that now, not when Ares looked so worried as he gazed down at his daughter. Keras couldn't imagine the fear Ares must have felt when Megan had gone into labor almost 3 weeks early. His brother looked as if someone had just put him through hell in the last 24 hours, his face pale and drawn, and his overlong tawny hair mussed, as if he had repeatedly stabbed his fingers through it. Keras felt partly to blame for his brother's condition. Aries had probably been worrying about him, and then Megan had gone into labor.
Not a dick.
Megan sounded tired, her voice drifting from behind his brother.
Just maybe try not to worry me next time.
Aries looked over his shoulder at her.
Next time?
Megan didn't answer that.
He was not the only one to blame for this. Healing Hades did not help.
Persephone glanced at Hades, where he leaned against the wall near the corner of the room. He blended with the black paint in his tunic and trousers, his long legs crossed at his ankles and his arms folded over his chest. His onyx hair was wild, as messy as Aries, and his blue eyes held a worried edge as they remained fixed on the baby in his son's arms.
But I am glad you healed him for me. I am eternally grateful to you, Megan.
Persephone smiled at her and then came to Aries and checked the baby, lightly running her fingers over her from head to toe. Both Hades and Aries watched her like a hawk, fear mounting in their eyes. When she lifted her gaze from the baby to Aries, she smiled softly again.
She is strong. She will be fine.
Palpable relief flowed around Keras, and the air in the room instantly lightened. Cassandra went to the doorway and leaned out into the hallway.
She's here!
There wasn't a dry eye in the room as everyone rushed into it, pushing past him and Enyo, their murmured words of congratulations distant in Keras's ears as he stared at the baby. Enyo squeezed his hand, and he managed to drag his eyes away from the little girl, looked at her and smiled as all the fear rushed out of him. Aries turned away from everyone and stepped back, revealing Megan where she sat on the large bed, her face pale and dark hair slick with sweat. She beamed, her tired chocolate eyes brightening as they landed on Aries, and he went to her and held the baby out to her, gently placed their daughter in her waiting arms. Megan cooed at her, stroked her face with one finger, and smiled as tears slipped down her cheeks. Aries sank onto the bed beside her and wrapped one arm around her and one around the baby she held.
You were amazing, sweetheart. Look at her.
Megan lifted her eyes from the baby and beamed again, causing more tears to fall.
Look at what we made.
He smiled.
Gods, you're amazing. Wonderful. I can't stop looking at her. Sweetheart, this is the most incredible gift. I love you both.
He dropped a kiss on her sweat-dotted brow. Hades finally pushed away from the wall, drawing to a halt near the foot of the bed, his blue eyes fixed on the wriggling baby. Persephone went to him and took hold of his hand, stroked it lightly as he stood immobile, as frozen by the sight of the child as Keras was. Enyo caressed the back of his hand too, and he looked at her again, lifted her hand and kissed it. Her eyes widened slightly.
Stay right there. I have something I have to do.
She released his hand, and he watched her as she went to Megan and Aries.
May I?
She said. Aries nodded and made room for her. She kneeled on the bed, took hold of the baby's hand, and looked at Megan.
Her name? We went through a million, but the moment I saw her, I knew the right one.
Megan smiled softly.
Theodora.
Aries grinned like an idiot.
Adora.
He gazed at his daughter as he shortened her name.
My precious gift.
Our precious gift.
Megan turned her smile on his brother.
Our little Adora.
Aries teared up again. Enyo leaned over Theodora and pressed a kiss to her hand, whispered words against it, and then withdrew. A small sword and shield appeared on her hand by her thumb. Enyo's favor, a bond that would tie them together for the rest of their lives and give Theodora strength and courage. His beautiful goddess returned to him, and rather than taking hold of her hand, he slipped his arm around her shoulder. Keras looked at his family. He had felt as if their lives had been on hold for the last 2 centuries because they were away from home. But they hadn't been. Everyone's lives had been moving forwards, growing and changing, even his. Enyo leaned into his side, and he felt whole again for the first time in a long time, filled with emotion that he wasn't afraid of or didn't want to erase. He wanted to feel this moment in its entirety. The joy, the fear, the hope. The room overflowed with emotion as everyone took turns in meeting little Theodora, and for once he didn't feel as if he was drowning. He looked at Enyo, aware he had her to thank for that. She smiled at him, warmth in her jade eyes as she met his for only a moment before they returned to the baby. She tiptoed and kissed his cheek, and he released her, watched her as she broke away from him to fuss over the baby with everyone else. Another feeling filled him as he watched her doting on Theodora, a need that ran deep. He wanted to see her holding their own child one day. One day. Right now, he had 2 centuries of being apart from her to make up for. She slid him a look, one that said she wanted to get started right now. He looked at his brothers, at their women. From where he was standing, it looked as if Theodora might get a cousin before the year was out. Enyo came to him again and shook her head as she whispered into his ear.
You have nothing to fear from me. I was only teasing you. My coin is on Cassandra.
He glanced at the sorceress. She didn't look particularly broody. Enyo gently took hold of his jaw and shifted his face to the right, to Diamond. Keras pursed his lips and tilted his head slightly, conceding that she did have a point. His brother looked as if he was contemplating whisking Cassandra away right that second to make a baby of their own with her.
Shoo, give them some space now. I believe a celebration is in order.
Persephone waved her hands towards the door. Hades grimaced. Not a celebration. His father rubbed his chest through his tunic. She fluttered her lashes.
Just a small one, family only. It is not every day we have a grandchild.
She almost squealed that word. Keras froze as she looked at all his brothers and then him. Could see in her eyes she was plotting ways to get more grandchildren already. He grabbed Enyo and stepped, whisking her away to his palace. He set her down on the terrace overlooking the garden, and she blew out her breath and pretended to wipe her hand across her forehead.
That was close,
she said. He frowned at her. She was mocking him, but he didn't see her leaping at the chance to have a baby to placate his mother.
We should probably get cleaned up and dressed for the occasion.
She stepped back and looked him over, a wicked glint in her eyes that said they would be doing more than just dressing after they had washed. When he didn't say anything, she took hold of his hand and tugged on it. He went with her and stilled again as he looked at his palace. She stopped and turned back to him.
What is it?
It's over, he said, feeling a bit like a fool as it hit him. She came back to him.
It really is. And now you're really home.
Home. He mulled that over as he looked at his palace, as he thought about his brothers and his parents. And then Enyo. He lowered his gaze to lock with hers. This isn't home. She frowned at him. Home was never a place. It's taken me 2 centuries to see that. Home was a feeling. Home is my family. No. He pressed his hand to her chest. Home is here. It's wherever you are. I wasn't fighting to get back here. I was fighting to get back to you. Tears lined her dark lashes. She leaned into him, tiptoed, and brushed her lips across his.
My home is with you, too. I am sorry it took me so long to realize that.
He wrapped her in his arms, that sensation of being home beating inside him as he kissed her, as she held him too. She took hold of his hands and backed away from him, luring him towards the palace as their lips parted. He liked that wicked gleam in her eyes. Where are we going? He murmured as he let her lead him. She smiled saucily.
To make up for lost time.
That he could definitely go along with. Keras pulled her into his arms, kissed her, and stepped. The end. This has been Keras, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book Number 7, written by Felicity Heaton and narrated by Eric G. Dove. Copyright 2020 by Felicity Heaton. Production copyright 2020 by Felicity Heaton.